Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, we travel to the suburbs of Houston, Texas, to the quiet community of Humble, where on a spring night in 2022, 16-year-old girl named Lauren Juma would make desperate phone calls for help that would ultimately come too late. This is a story about trust betrayed in the most horrific way possible, about a teenager whose dreams of serving her country were cut short by evil that lived under her own roof, and about a family's fight for justice against a predator who wore the mask of a caring stepfather. Lauren Juma was just 16 years old when her life was taken from her on April 29, 2022. She was a sophomore at Nimitz High School, with big dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of her suburban Texas neighborhood. Lauren wanted to become a police officer or join the military after graduation, noble aspirations that spoke to her desire to serve others and make a difference in the world. She was a cheerleader, a daughter, a sister, and a young woman who should have had decades ahead of her to pursue those dreams. Instead, her story became one of the most disturbing cases of domestic violence and predatory behavior to shock the Houston area in recent years. It's a story that highlights the dangers that can exist within the supposed safety of home, and the courage of a young woman who fought to save herself even as those who should have protected her failed to arrive in time. In the world of true crime, Lauren's case represents one of the most heartbreaking categories of violence, crimes committed by those who hold positions of trust within families. Her killer was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, but a man who had been welcomed into her home, who had sat at her dinner table, who had been trusted with her safety and well-being. The betrayal of that trust makes this case particularly devastating, and serves as a stark reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Humble, Texas, sits in the northern reaches of Harris County, about 20 miles northeast of downtown Houston. Once a small oil town that grew up around the railroad in the early, Humble has evolved into a sprawling suburban community that serves as home to families seeking the American dream of home ownership, good schools, and safe neighborhoods, where children can grow up with opportunities their parents might never have had. The city, with a population of around 16,000, maintains that small-town feel despite its proximity to one of America's largest metropolitan areas. Tree-lined streets wind through neighborhoods filled with modest ranch homes and newer subdivisions, where families barbecue on weekends and children ride their bikes on sidewalks that feel worlds away from the urban challenges of nearby Houston. For Lauren Juma, Humble represented both the security of home and the launching pad for her future ambitions. She lived in a household that, from the outside, appeared to embody the stability and success that many families strive for. Her mother, Lori Young, had worked hard to build a life for her daughters, creating the kind of home environment where a teenager could focus on school, cheerleading, and planning for the future. Lauren was everything a parent hopes their teenager will be: responsible, ambitious, and grounded. Her choice to pursue cheerleading at Nimitz High School demonstrated her commitment to teamwork and physical fitness, qualities that would serve her well in her dream of joining law enforcement or the military. She was the kind of teenager who had her eye on the future, who understood that her choices in high school would shape her opportunities as an adult. At 16, Lauren was navigating the complex world of adolescence with the kind of maturity that impressed the adults in her life. She was old enough to understand the importance of her education and her extracurricular activities, but young enough to still depend on her family for guidance and support. She was at that crucial age where teenagers begin to assert their independence while still needing the safety net that parents provide. The Juma Young household included Lauren's sister, Kareka Harmon, who was older and served as both sibling and mentor. The relationship between the sisters was close, built on years of shared experiences and the kind of bond that develops between siblings who have faced life's challenges together. Kareka understood Lauren's dreams and aspirations, and she was one of the people Lauren turned to when she needed advice or support. Lauren's mother, Lori Young, had been in a relationship with Van Henry Brisbane, a man who had become a significant presence in the household. At 60 years old, Brisbane was considerably older than Lori, but he had integrated himself into the family structure in a way that seemed natural and comfortable. He lived with the family, shared meals with them, and appeared to be a stable, caring presence in the lives of both Lori and her daughters. To outside observers, the relationship between Brisbane and the family appeared healthy and supportive. He was the kind of man who seemed to understand the importance of family, who treated Laurie's daughters with apparent respect and care, and who appeared to genuinely care about their well-being and success. There were no obvious red flags, no warning signs that would have alerted anyone to the darkness that lay beneath his carefully constructed facade. Lauren's relationship with Brisbane was by all accounts positive. She treated him with the respect due to an adult family member, and he appeared to reciprocate with the kind of caring attention that a stepfather might show. The family functioned as a unit, with Brisbane playing the role of the supportive partner and father figure that many single mothers hope to find for their children. The normalcy of their family life was what made the events of April 29, 2022, so shocking and unexpected. This was not a household marked by obvious dysfunction or violence. There were no previous calls to police for domestic disturbances, no neighbors reporting strange behavior or concerning incidents. The family appeared to be living the kind of quiet, stable life that represents the American dream for many working-class families. Lauren's dreams of law enforcement or military service reflected her desire to serve others and make a positive difference in the world. These were not casual career choices, but thoughtful decisions that spoke to her character and values. She understood that both paths would require dedication, discipline, and sacrifice, but she was willing to make those commitments to pursue work that would be meaningful and important. The spring of 2022 should have been a time of excitement and anticipation for Lauren. As a sophomore, she was beginning to think seriously about her junior and senior years, about college applications, about the steps she would need to take to achieve her goals. She was at the age where the future feels both distant and immediate, where teenagers begin to understand that their choices have consequences that will shape their adult lives. As the spring of 2022 progressed, subtle changes began to occur in the Jumayung household that would later take on sinister significance. These changes were so gradual and seemingly minor that they might have gone unnoticed by most people, but they represented the beginning of a transformation in Van Brisbane's behavior that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The first signs of trouble were probably so subtle that Lauren herself might not have immediately recognized them as warning signs. Perhaps Brisbane began to pay her attention that felt slightly different from the fatherly interest he had shown before. Maybe he lingered a little too long in conversations with her, or his compliments about her appearance became more frequent or more personal than they had been in the past. These kinds of behavioral changes in predators often begin so gradually that victims don't recognize them as the beginning of a pattern of grooming and escalation. What might feel like increased attention or special interest can actually be the first steps in a process designed to normalize inappropriate behavior and create opportunities for more serious violations of boundaries. Lauren was an intelligent, perceptive teenager, but she was also in the vulnerable position of living with a man who had been trusted by her mother and accepted into their family. The natural inclination to give family members the benefit of the doubt, to rationalize behavior that feels uncomfortable but not clearly wrong, can make it difficult for victims to recognize danger even when it's developing in their own homes. The dynamics of Lauren's family situation made her particularly vulnerable to this kind of predatory behavior. As a teenager living in her mother's home with her mother's boyfriend, Lauren was in a position where she might have felt that she couldn't easily express concerns about Brisbane's behavior without creating family conflict or being dismissed as being dramatic or oversensitive. Predators often specifically target situations where their victims feel isolated or unable to easily seek help. Brisbane's position as Laurie's boyfriend gave him both access to Lauren and a level of protection from suspicion, since families generally don't expect the people they trust most to be capable of harming their children. The spring of 2022 was also a time when Lauren was dealing with the normal stresses and challenges of being a 16-year-old. She was managing schoolwork, cheerleading responsibilities, and the social pressures that come with being a teenager. These normal adolescent stresses might have made it even more difficult for her to recognize that the changes in Brisbane's behavior represented a genuine threat to her safety. As April 2022 approached, Lauren's mother, Laurie, was occasionally traveling for work, leaving Lauren alone in the house with Brisbane. These situations, which might have seemed perfectly normal and safe to a mother who trusted her boyfriend, created opportunities for Brisbane to act on whatever dark impulses he had been harboring. The isolation that occurs when potential victims are left alone with predators is one of the most dangerous aspects of these situations. Without other adults present to observe interactions or serve as witnesses, predators feel emboldened to escalate their behavior, testing boundaries and pushing limits in ways they might not attempt when others are around. Lauren, as a responsible teenager, would have had no reason to fear being alone with Brisbane. He had been part of her family's life for a significant period, and there was no reason for her to suspect that he represented any danger to her. The trust that had been built over months or years of normal family interactions would have made it difficult for her to suddenly view him as a threat. The tragedy of Lauren's situation was that she was trapped by the very trust and family bonds that should have protected her. The man who should have been her protector, who should have been someone she could turn to for help and support, was instead the source of the danger she faced. This inversion of the natural order of family protection is one of the most devastating aspects of crimes committed by family members or trusted individuals. As April 29, 2022 approached, Lauren was probably looking forward to the weekend and the activities that filled her teenage life. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal day she would ever experience, that the man living in her home was preparing to commit acts of violence that would end her life and destroy her family's peace forever. The final days before April 29th were likely filled with the ordinary routines of teenage life: school, cheerleading practice, time with friends, and the countless small moments that make up a normal adolescent existence. Lauren was living the life of a typical American teenager, focused on her present responsibilities and future dreams, unaware that danger was lurking so close to home. April 29th, 2022 began like countless other days in Lauren Juma's life. It was a Friday, the beginning of what should have been another typical weekend for a 16-year-old high school student. The weather in Humble was pleasant, with the kind of mild spring temperatures that make Texas bearable before the oppressive heat of summer sets in. Lauren attended her classes at Nimitz High School, probably participated in cheerleading activities, and looked forward to the weekend ahead. Lori Young, Lauren's mother, was out of town on a work trip, leaving Lauren alone in the house with Van Brisbane. This arrangement had probably occurred before without incident, and there was no reason for either Lauren or her mother to view this as anything other than a normal part of their family routine. Brisbane had been living with the family and had been trusted with Lauren's safety and well-being numerous times before. As evening approached, Lauren was probably settling into her normal routine, finishing homework, perhaps talking with friends on social media, and enjoying the kind of relaxed Friday evening that teenagers cherish. She had no reason to suspect that this night would be different from any other. No warning that the man she had trusted as a family member was about to reveal himself as a dangerous predator. The first sign that something was wrong came when Lauren contacted her mother via FaceTime. The video call that should have been a routine check-in between mother and daughter instead became a desperate plea for help. Lauren told her mother that Brisbane was acting weird and that she was concerned about his behavior. The fact that she felt compelled to call her mother about Brisbane's actions suggests that whatever he was doing was clearly inappropriate and frightening enough to overcome any reluctance she might have felt about reporting his behavior. For Lori Young, receiving this call from her daughter must have been every parent's nightmare. She was hours away from home, unable to immediately respond to her daughter's concerns, and forced to try to assess the seriousness of the situation from a distance. The limitation of being out of town when her daughter needed her most would haunt her for the rest of her life. The details of exactly what Brisbane was doing that prompted Lauren's call to her mother are not fully known, but the fact that she described his behavior as weird and felt the need to contact her mother suggests that he was acting in ways that made her uncomfortable and afraid. This might have been the moment when Brisbane's carefully maintained facade finally began to crumble, revealing the predatory intentions he had been hiding. Lauren's decision to call her mother demonstrated both her intelligence and her desperation. She recognized that she was in a dangerous situation and that she needed help. But she was also trapped in a house with a man who was larger and stronger than she was. Her options for escape were limited, and she was forced to rely on getting help from outside the house. After speaking with her mother, Lauren also contacted her sister, Karika Harmon. The fact that she reached out to multiple family members suggests that she was increasingly frightened and that she understood the seriousness of her situation. Karika would later describe Lauren's state of mind during this call, saying that she just wanted to get away, that's all she wanted. The image of Lauren trapped in her own home, desperately trying to get help from family members who were too far away to provide immediate assistance, is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. She was a teenager who found herself in a situation that no child should ever have to face, forced to try to protect herself from a predator who had been trusted by her family. As the evening progressed, Lauren's situation became increasingly desperate. Brisbane was apparently escalating his behavior, moving from whatever actions had initially made her uncomfortable to more aggressive and threatening conduct. The exact timeline of events is not entirely clear, but it's apparent that Lauren was fighting for her safety and her life as the night wore on. At some point during the evening, Brisbane apparently attempted to sexually assault Lauren. The evidence that would later be presented in court suggested that he had tried to rape her, turning what had been a normal family living situation into a scene of horrific violence and violation. Lauren, showing incredible courage and strength, fought back against her attacker, refusing to be victimized without resistance. The attempted sexual assault represents the most devastating betrayal of trust imaginable. Brisbane had been welcomed into the family as a trusted partner and father figure, and he had used that position of trust to gain access to Lauren for the purpose of victimizing her. The violation of family bonds and the abuse of his position of authority made his actions particularly heinous. Lauren's resistance to Brisbane's assault demonstrated the kind of courage and determination that might have served her well in her dream career in law enforcement or the military. Even in the face of overwhelming danger, she refused to submit to his attack, fighting back with everything she had to protect herself and preserve her dignity. The calls for help that Lauren had made to her mother and sister had alerted them to the fact that she was in danger, and they had contacted law enforcement. Harris County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the humble home, but they would arrive too late to prevent the tragedy that was already unfolding inside the house. As law enforcement officers approached the house, they could hear the sounds of struggle and violence coming from inside. The officers were prepared to enter the home to rescue Lauren, but before they could reach her, they heard the sound that would haunt everyone involved in this case. 2 gunshots that ended Lauren's young life and destroyed her family's world forever. The timing of the gunshots, occurring just as help was arriving, suggests that Brisbane may have decided to kill Lauren rather than face the consequences of his actions. The fact that he chose murder over accountability for his attempted rape demonstrates the depth of his depravity and his complete lack of regard for human life. The Harris County Sheriff's deputies, who responded to the emergency call at the Jumeirah home on that April night in 2022, were experienced law enforcement officers who had seen their share of domestic violence situations, but nothing could have prepared them for the horrific scene they would encounter inside the house. When the officers arrived at the residence, they could hear sounds of distress and struggle coming from inside the home. The deputies were preparing to make entry to rescue Lauren when they heard 2 distinct gunshots. The sound of gunfire transformed what had been a rescue operation into a potential homicide scene, and the officers knew that they were now facing a much more dangerous and complex situation. The protocols for law enforcement response to active shooter situations are designed to prioritize the safety of officers while also attempting to neutralize threats and provide aid to victims. However, these protocols are based on the assumption that officers will be able to respond before the worst violence occurs. In Lauren's case, the timing of the gunshots suggested that they had arrived moments too late to save her life. After the gunshots, the officers maintained their position and attempted to establish communication with anyone inside the house. They needed to determine whether the shooter was still active, whether there were additional victims, and whether it was safe for them to enter the residence. These critical minutes of assessment and preparation felt like hours to the officers who knew that someone inside might be dying or already dead. When law enforcement finally entered the home, they found Lauren's body and encountered Van Brisbane. The scene inside the house was one of the most disturbing that these experienced officers had ever witnessed. Lauren had been shot in the head, and the evidence at the scene suggested that she had been the victim of an attempted sexual assault before being murdered. The physical evidence discovered at the scene painted a picture of the final moments of Lauren's life that was both heartbreaking and enraging. According to court documents that would later be filed in the case, Lauren's pants were found around her ankles, and Brisbane was discovered with his pants down as well. This evidence clearly indicated that he had been in the process of sexually assaulting her when law enforcement arrived. The discovery of Brisbane with his pants down when officers arrived was particularly significant evidence that would later be used in court to establish his intent and the nature of his attack on Lauren. This physical evidence corroborated the theory that he had attempted to rape her and had killed her when she resisted and when he realized that help was coming. For the law enforcement officers who processed this scene, the evidence of what Lauren had endured in her final moments was deeply traumatic. These officers, many of whom had teenagers of their own, were forced to document and investigate a crime that represented every parent's worst nightmare. The professional detachment required to process such a scene while maintaining the emotional stability needed to do their jobs effectively is one of the most challenging aspects of law enforcement work. Brisbane was taken into custody at the scene without further resistance. The man who had just committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable offered no explanation for his actions and showed no apparent remorse for what he had done. His demeanor in the immediate aftermath of the murder was described by officers as eerily calm, suggesting either shock or a complete lack of empathy for the life he had just taken. The arrest of Brisbane marked the beginning of a criminal investigation that would eventually lead to his conviction and life sentence. But it also marked the beginning of a nightmare for Lauren's family that would last for years. Lori Young, who had been frantically trying to get help for her daughter from out of town, was now faced with the reality that her daughter was dead and that the man she had trusted and loved was responsible for her murder. The medical examiner who responded to the scene confirmed that Lauren had died from gunshot wounds to the head. The autopsy that would be performed later would provide additional details about the nature of her injuries and the circumstances of her death. But the basic facts were clear. She had been murdered by a man who had been trusted with her safety and well-being. The crime scene processing that followed Lauren's murder was extensive and thorough. Investigators collected physical evidence, documented the scene with photographs and measurements, and began the painstaking process of building a case that would ensure Brisbane's conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal system requires that every detail be properly documented and preserved for trial. For Kerika Harmon, Lauren's sister, the news of her sister's death was devastating beyond words. She had been one of the last people to speak with Lauren, and she had tried to help her sister get to safety. The knowledge that Lauren had died despite her family's efforts to help her was a source of guilt and grief that would haunt Kerika for years to come. The notification of Lauren's family members and friends began immediately after her death was confirmed. Each phone call brought the devastating news to another person who had loved and cared about her, spreading waves of grief and shock throughout her community. The news that a popular, well-liked teenager had been murdered by her mother's boyfriend sent shockwaves through Nimitz High School and the broader Humble community. The immediate aftermath of Lauren's murder was marked by the kind of intense media attention that often accompanies particularly shocking crimes. The details of the case, a 16-year-old cheerleader murdered by her mother's boyfriend during an attempted rape, were the kind of story that captures public attention and generates both NIFI for the victim and outrage at the perpetrator. The news of Lauren Juma's murder spread through the Humble community like wildfire, creating ripples of shock, grief, and fear that extended far beyond her immediate family and friends. Nimitz High School, where Lauren had been a sophomore and cheerleader, became the epicenter of a community trying to process the senseless loss of a young person who had represented hope, ambition, and the promise of a bright future. The administration at Nimitz High School faced the difficult task of informing students and staff about Lauren's death, while also providing support for those who were struggling to cope with the tragedy. Grief counselors were brought in to help students process their emotions, and special assemblies were held to honor Lauren's memory and discuss the importance of seeking help when facing dangerous situations. Lauren's cheerleading teammates were particularly devastated by her death. The bonds formed between teammates are often especially strong, built on shared experiences, mutual support, and the kind of trust that develops when young people work together toward common goals. For these young women, Lauren's murder was not just the loss of a teammate, but the loss of a friend who had been part of their daily lives and future plans. The cheerleading squad organized memorial activities to honor Lauren's memory, including dedicated performances and the creation of a memorial fund to support causes that had been important to her. These activities provided the squad members with a way to channel their grief into positive action while ensuring that Lauren's memory would continue to inspire others. The teachers and staff at Nimitz High School, who had worked with Lauren, remembered her as a dedicated student who had been serious about her education and committed to her future goals. Her dream of becoming a police officer or joining the military had been well known among her teachers, and they had been supportive of her ambitions and impressed by her maturity and determination. The guidance counselors at the school used Lauren's death as an opportunity to discuss important safety topics with students, including recognizing signs of predatory behavior and knowing how to seek help when facing dangerous situations. These conversations were difficult but necessary as they helped other students understand that danger can come from unexpected sources, and that it's important to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. The broader Humble community rallied around Lauren's family, organizing fundraising events, memorial services, and other activities designed to show support and honor her memory. The outpouring of community support demonstrated the impact that Lauren had made during her brief life, and the respect and affection that people felt for her and her family. Local law enforcement officers, including those who had responded to the scene of Lauren's murder, were deeply affected by the case. Many of these officers had teenagers of their own, and they understood that Lauren's death represented a failure of the systems that are supposed to protect children from harm. The case served as a reminder of the importance of their work and the devastating consequences when predators are able to operate within families. The media coverage of Lauren's case brought attention to the broader issues of domestic violence and the vulnerability of teenagers to predatory behavior by trusted adults. News reports about the case often included information about resources for victims of domestic violence and emphasized the importance of reporting suspicious or inappropriate behavior before it escalates to violence. Social media played a significant role in memorializing Lauren and spreading awareness about her case. Her friends and family members created tribute pages and shared memories of her life, her dreams, and her personality. These online memorials served as gathering places for people who wanted to honor her memory and express their grief and support for her family. The GoFundMe campaigns and other fundraising efforts organized on behalf of Lauren's family raised significant amounts of money to help with funeral expenses and other costs associated with her death. The generosity shown by both people who had known Lauren personally and complete strangers who were moved by her story demonstrated the impact that her case had on the broader community. Local churches and religious organizations held special services and prayer gatherings for Lauren and her family. These events provided comfort and support for people who were struggling to understand how such a senseless tragedy could occur and how to find meaning and hope in the aftermath of such devastating loss. The school district implemented new safety protocols and educational programs in response to Lauren's death, recognizing that her case highlighted important gaps in how young people are educated about recognizing and responding to predatory behavior. These new programs were designed to help students understand the warning signs of inappropriate adult behavior and to encourage them to seek help when they feel unsafe. The anniversary of Lauren's death became an annual occasion for remembrance and reflection in the Humble community. Memorial services, scholarship fundraisers, and awareness events were organized to ensure that her memory would continue to inspire positive action and that her death would not be forgotten as time passed. The arrest of Van Henry Brisbane for the murder of Lauren Juma marked the beginning of a complex legal process that would take more than 2 years to reach its conclusion. The Harris County District Attorney's Office, led by District Attorney Kim Ogg, assigned experienced prosecutors to the case, understanding that the nature of the crime and the evidence involved would require careful handling and thorough preparation. The initial charges filed against Brisbane were serious but would eventually be upgraded as investigators continued to process evidence and build their case. The original murder charge was significant, but the evidence of attempted sexual assault that had been discovered at the scene suggested that more serious charges might be appropriate as the case developed. Brisbane's first court appearance was a somber affair that drew significant media attention and brought Lauren's family members face to face with her killer for the first time since her death. The man who had lived in their home, who had been trusted with Lauren's safety, now sat in an orange jumpsuit as a defendant in a capital murder case. The bond hearing for Brisbane was particularly significant because of the nature of the charges and the evidence that had been collected. The prosecution argued that he represented a significant danger to the community and that his actions demonstrated such depravity that he should be held without bond or with bond set at an extremely high amount. The judge initially set Brisbane's bond at $1 million, but as more details about the case emerged during subsequent hearings, the bond was doubled to $2 million. This increase reflected the court's growing understanding of the severity of the crime and the evidence that prosecutors had collected against him. The defense team assigned to represent Brisbane faced one of the most challenging cases in criminal law, defending a client who had been caught at the scene of a horrific crime with overwhelming physical evidence of his guilt. Their strategy would necessarily focus on avoiding the death penalty rather than establishing innocence, given the strength of the evidence against their client. The upgrade of charges from murder to capital murder was a significant development in the case that reflected the prosecutor's assessment of the evidence and their determination to seek the most serious possible consequences for Brisbane's actions. Capital murder charges in Texas carry the possibility of the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The capital murder charge was based on the evidence that Brisbane had killed Lauren during the course of attempting to sexually assault her. Texas law defines capital murder to include murders committed during the course of certain felonies, including sexual assault, and the evidence collected at the scene clearly supported this enhanced charge. The pre-trial phase of the case involved extensive discovery as both sides prepared for trial. The prosecution had to organize and present the physical evidence collected at the scene, the testimony of law enforcement officers, the medical examiner's findings, and the statements made by Lauren to her family members before her death. The defense team conducted their own investigation, though their options were limited by the overwhelming nature of the evidence against their client. They reviewed the crime scene evidence, interviewed potential witnesses, and explored possible avenues for challenging the prosecution's case or arguing for mitigation during sentencing. The mental health evaluation of Brisbane was an important component of the pretrial proceedings. The defense team needed to determine whether their client was competent to stand trial and whether there were any mental health issues that might be relevant to either his culpability or his sentencing. The victim impact statements prepared by Lauren's family members were among the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case. These statements described the impact of her death on her loved ones, the dreams and aspirations that had been cut short, and the ongoing pain and trauma experienced by those who had known and loved her. The media coverage of the pretrial proceedings kept the case in the public eye and ensured that Lauren's story continued to be told. The attention also put pressure on the legal system to ensure that justice was served, and that Brisbane received the maximum possible punishment for his crimes. The delays and continuances that are common in complex criminal cases were particularly difficult for Lauren's family members, who were eager to see justice served and to have some closure in their long journey through the legal system. Each postponement represented another delay in their ability to move forward with their lives and their grieving process. The jury selection process for the trial was extensive and careful, as attorneys for both sides worked to identify jurors who could fairly evaluate the evidence, while also being able to handle the disturbing nature of the case. The pool of potential jurors was questioned extensively about their ability to consider the death penalty and their reactions to cases involving sexual violence against minors. The trial of Van Henry Brisbane for the capital murder of Lauren Juma began in October 2024, more than 2 years after her death and nearly 3 years after his arrest. The Harris County Courthouse became the setting for a legal proceeding that would finally provide detailed answers about what had happened on that terrible night in April 2022, though those answers would come at the cost of forcing Lauren's family to relive the worst moments of their lives. The prosecution team, led by experienced capital murder prosecutors, opened their case with a clear and straightforward presentation of the evidence. They told the jury about Lauren's dreams and aspirations, her phone calls for help to her mother and sister, and the horrific events that had unfolded in her home on April 20. The timeline presented by prosecutors painted a picture of escalating violence and predatory behavior. They described how Brisbane had been alone in the house with Lauren, how his behavior had become increasingly inappropriate and threatening, and how Lauren had desperately tried to get help from her family members, who were too far away to provide immediate assistance. The physical evidence presented at trial was overwhelming in its implications. The crime scene photographs, the medical examiner's testimony, and the evidence collected by investigators all pointed to the same conclusion, that Brisbane had attempted to sexually assault Lauren and had killed her when she resisted and when he realized that law enforcement was coming to her aid. The testimony of the law enforcement officers who had responded to the scene was particularly powerful. These experienced officers described hearing Lauren's calls for help, the sounds of struggle, and then the gunshots that ended her life. Their testimony provided the jury with a minute-by-minute account of the final moments of Lauren's life and the immediate aftermath of her murder. The medical examiner's testimony was clinical but devastating in its implications. The autopsy findings confirmed that Lauren had died from gunshot wounds to the head, and the physical evidence collected during the examination supported the prosecution's theory that she had been the victim of an attempted sexual assault before being killed. The prosecution also presented evidence of Brisbane's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the murder. The fact that he had been found with his pants down when officers arrived at the scene was particularly damning evidence that supported their theory about his intent and actions during the assault on Lauren. The defense team faced an almost impossible task in trying to present a case that might spare their client from the death penalty. They could not reasonably argue that Brisbane had not killed Lauren, given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. So their strategy focused on trying to present mitigating factors that might convince the jury to impose a life sentence rather than death. The defense attempted to present evidence about Brisbane's background and mental state, hoping to find factors that might explain his actions without excusing them. However, the nature of the crime and the evidence of premeditation and predatory behavior made it difficult to present a compelling case for mitigation. The testimony of Lauren's family members was among the most emotional and powerful evidence presented during the trial. Her sister, Kereka Harmon, described their final phone conversation and Lauren's desperate attempts to get help. Her mother, Laura Young, testified about receiving the FaceTime call from her daughter and her frantic attempts to coordinate help for her daughter from hundreds of miles away. The victim impact statements read during the trial provided the jury with a fuller picture of who Lauren had been and what her death had meant to those who loved her. These statements described not just the loss of a daughter and sister, but the loss of all the potential contributions Lauren might have made to her community and to the world through her planned career in law enforcement or the military. The prosecution's closing argument was a powerful summation of the evidence and a call for justice for Lauren. The prosecutors reminded the jury of Lauren's youth, her dreams, and the trust that had been violated when Brisbane chose to attack and kill her. They argued that the evidence clearly supported a verdict of guilty on the capital murder charge, and that the circumstances of the crime warranted the most serious possible punishment. The defense's closing argument focused on asking the jury to consider life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. While they could not dispute the evidence of Brisbane's guilt, they attempted to present factors that might lead to a sentence of life without parole rather than execution. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. When the foreman announced that they had found Van Henry Brisbane guilty of capital murder, Lauren's family members experienced a mixture of relief and continued grief. The guilty verdict provided validation that justice was being served, but it could never bring Lauren back or undo the trauma of her loss. Following Brisbane's conviction for capital murder, the trial moved into the punishment phase, where the jury would decide whether he should be sentenced to death or to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This phase of the trial required the jury to consider additional evidence about the circumstances of the crime and the character of both the victim and the defendant. The prosecution presented evidence during the punishment phase that painted a complete picture of the impact of Lauren's death on her family and community. They emphasized the particularly heinous nature of the crime, the betrayal of trust involved, and the fact that Lauren had been just 16 years old when her life was taken from her. The defense team presented what mitigation evidence they could find, attempting to provide context for Brisbane's actions without excusing them. However, the nature of the crime and the evidence of premeditation made it difficult to present compelling reasons why his life should be spared. The jury's decision on punishment came after careful deliberation about the appropriate consequences for Brisbane's actions. In the end, they sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person and that he would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. For Lauren's family, the life sentence provided a sense of justice and closure, though nothing could truly heal the wounds left by her death. Knowing that Brisbane would never be free again offered some comfort, even as they continued to grieve the loss of their beloved daughter and sister. The sentencing marked the end of the formal legal proceedings, but it was not the end of Lauren's story or her impact on others. Her family made it clear that they intended to honor her memory by continuing to speak out about the dangers of predatory behavior and the importance of protecting young people from those who would harm them. In the months and years following Brisbane's conviction and sentencing, Lauren's family worked to ensure that her memory would live on and that her death would serve as a warning to other families about the dangers that can exist within trusted relationships. They established memorial funds and participated in awareness campaigns designed to educate parents and teenagers about recognizing signs of predatory behavior. The Lauren Juma case became a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. The combination of factors that led to her death, the trusted position of her attacker, the isolation that made her vulnerable, and the rapid escalation from inappropriate behavior to deadly violence, provided important lessons for those working to prevent similar tragedies. Nimitz High School continued to honor Lauren's memory through annual memorial events and the establishment of scholarship programs for students pursuing careers in law enforcement or military service. These memorials ensured that her dreams and aspirations would continue to inspire other young people even after her death. The broader community of Humble, Texas was forever changed by Lauren's death. Parents became more vigilant about the adults they allowed into their children's lives, and conversations about personal safety and recognizing danger became more common in homes and schools throughout the area. Lauren's case also contributed to ongoing discussions about domestic violence prevention and the particular vulnerabilities faced by teenagers in homes where predators have gained positions of trust. Her story served as a reminder that danger can come from unexpected sources and that it's important to take reports of inappropriate behavior seriously. The impact of Lauren's death extended beyond her immediate community through media coverage and online advocacy. Her story became part of the larger conversation about protecting children from predatory adults and ensuring that justice is served when such crimes occur. For those who knew Lauren personally, the memories of her personality, her dreams, and her potential continued to provide comfort and inspiration. She was remembered not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a young woman who had faced danger with courage and who had fought to protect herself, even in the most desperate circumstances. As we reach the end of Lauren Juma's story, we're left with the profound sadness of a life cut tragically short and the lingering questions about how such evil can exist within the supposed safety of family relationships. Lauren was just 16 years old when she died, but in her brief life, she had already demonstrated the kind of character and determination that suggested she would have made significant contributions to her community and to the world. Her dreams of becoming a police officer or serving in the military were not casual teenage fantasies, but thoughtful choices that reflected her desire to serve others and make a positive difference. The courage she showed in her final moments, fighting against her attacker and trying to get help, demonstrated the same qualities that would have served her well in her chosen career path. The betrayal of trust that led to Lauren's death serves as a stark reminder that predators often gain access to their victims through positions of authority and trust within families. Her case highlights the importance of listening to children and teenagers when they express concerns about adult behavior, even when those adults are trusted family members or partners. The legal system's response to Lauren's murder, resulting in Brisbane's conviction and life sentence, provided some measure of justice for her family and community. However, no legal outcome could truly compensate for the loss of such a promising young life or heal the trauma experienced by those who loved her. Lauren's legacy lives on through the awareness her case has created about the dangers of predatory behavior within families and the importance of taking steps to protect vulnerable young people. Her memory continues to inspire others to pursue careers in law enforcement and military service, carrying forward the dreams she was never able to fulfill. In the quiet moments before sleep, we remember Lauren Juma not just as a victim of senseless violence, but as a young woman who faced unimaginable terror with courage and dignity. Her story reminds us of the preciousness of life, the importance of protecting the innocent, and the enduring power of memory to keep loved ones alive in our hearts. Rest in peace, Lauren. Your dreams live on in the lives you continue to inspire, and your courage in your final moments stands as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of ultimate evil. May your family find comfort in knowing that your story has helped protect others, and may justice served in your name provide some measure of peace to those who miss you most. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight we travel to the snow-covered roads of Oswego County, New York, where on a bitter winter night in January 2022, a 35-year-old woman named Rebecca Fink would take what should have been an ordinary car ride with her boyfriend that would tragically become her last. This is a story about domestic violence that escalated to unthinkable brutality, about a relationship that turned deadly on a rural road where help was miles away, and about a community's search for justice in the face of senseless loss. Rebecca Fink, known to her friends and family as Becky, was 35 years old when her life was taken from her on January 29, 2022. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a woman who deserved to see many more winters come and go in the scenic landscapes of central New York. Instead, her story became one of the most disturbing cases of domestic violence to shake the tight-knit communities of Oswego County, a region where neighbors look out for each other and where violence often feels like something that happens elsewhere. Rebecca's death occurred not in the heat of summer passion or the explosive tensions of a holiday gathering, but on an ordinary winter night when the roads were treacherous and the temperature was unforgiving. It was the kind of night when most people stayed home by their fires, when the smart thing to do was to avoid unnecessary travel and wait for better weather. But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. And sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the elements outside, but from the person sitting right beside us. The man responsible for Rebecca's death was Juan Rivera, her 47-year-old boyfriend, a man who had been trusted with her heart and her safety. Rivera was not a stranger who attacked her in a dark alley, or a random criminal who targeted her for robbery. He was someone she knew intimately, someone she had chosen to spend time with, someone she had presumably loved and trusted. The betrayal of that trust makes this case particularly devastating and serves as a stark reminder that the statistics on domestic violence are not just numbers. They represent real people, real relationships, and real lives lost to preventable tragedy. In the world of domestic violence, Rebecca's case represents one of the most horrific escalations possible. A situation where an argument or dispute transformed into deadly violence in a matter of moments. The remote location where her death occurred, the involvement of a vehicle as a weapon, and the calculated nature of Rivera's actions afterward all combine to make this case particularly disturbing and memorable. Oswego County sits in the heart of central New York, a region defined by its proximity to Lake Ontario, its harsh but beautiful winters, and its small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. With a population of just over 120,000 people, spread across nearly 1,000 square miles, it's the kind of place where major crimes make headlines for weeks and where tragedies like Rebecca's death ripple through multiple communities simultaneously. The county seat of Oswego is a historic city that grew up around the shipping industry and later became home to a major university, but much of the county consists of smaller towns and rural areas, where agriculture and small businesses provide the economic backbone. These are places like Fulton, Mexico, and New Haven, communities where people often stay for generations, where high school classmates end up raising their children together, and where the pace of life moves more slowly than in the urban centers downstate. For Rebecca Fink, Oswego County represented home in all the complex ways that word can mean. She had grown up in this area, had attended local schools, and had built relationships with people who had known her since childhood. She was part of the fabric of her community, someone whose absence would be noticed not just by her immediate family but by the broader network of friends, coworkers, and acquaintances who had intersected with her life over the years. At 35, Rebecca was at a stage of life where many people begin to think seriously about their future, about career advancement, about settling down, about the kind of legacy they want to leave behind. She was old enough to have experienced both the joys and disappointments that come with adulthood, but young enough to believe that her best years might still be ahead of her. She was navigating the complex world of adult relationships, trying to balance her desire for companionship and love with the practical realities of building a stable, fulfilling life. Rebecca's relationship with Juan Rivera represented hope for many of the things that adults seek in romantic partnerships: companionship, shared experiences, and emotional support. Rivera was 47 years old, 12 years older than Rebecca, and presumably someone who had enough life experience to be a stable, mature partner. The age difference might have seemed like an advantage, suggesting that he had moved beyond the impulsiveness and uncertainty that can characterize younger men's approach to relationship. From the outside, the relationship probably appeared to be progressing normally. They spent time together, traveled together, and shared the kinds of intimate moments that couples experience as they get to know each other more deeply. Rivera had integrated himself into Rebecca's life in ways that suggested permanence and commitment, and she had apparently trusted him enough to depend on him for transportation and companionship. The winter of 2021-2022 was particularly harsh in central New York, with frequent snowstorms, bitter cold temperatures, and the kind of weather that tests both infrastructure and human patience. These are the kinds of winters that bring communities together as neighbors help each other dig out from storms and check on elderly residents who might be struggling with heating bills or snow removal. But they're also the kinds of winters that can strain relationships, forcing couples to spend long hours together indoors and testing everyone's tolerance for stress and inconvenience. January 2022 was especially brutal, with multiple storms dumping heavy snow across the region and creating hazardous driving conditions that made even routine trips dangerous. The roads in rural areas like Mexico and New Haven were often the last to be plowed, and drivers had to be particularly careful to avoid sliding off into ditches or colliding with the poles and trees that lined these narrow rural routes. For Rebecca, the harsh winter weather was probably just another fact of life in central New York, something to be endured until spring returned with its promise of warmer temperatures and easier travel. She had lived through dozens of similar winters and had developed the practical skills that locals need to survive the season: keeping emergency supplies in the car, dressing appropriately for the cold, and avoiding unnecessary travel during the worst storms. The relationship between Rebecca and Juan had presumably weathered previous challenges and stresses. All couples face difficulties, and the pressures of winter weather, work stress, financial concerns, and the ordinary disappointments of adult life can test even the strongest bonds. Most healthy relationships survive these challenges and emerge stronger, with partners learning to support each other through difficult times and finding ways to resolve conflicts without violence. But some relationships contain hidden fault lines that only become apparent under extreme stress. Some people, particularly those with histories of violence or control issues, respond to relationship conflicts in ways that escalate rather than resolve tensions. The ability to manage anger, to communicate effectively during disagreements, and to respect boundaries even during heated arguments are skills that not everyone possesses, and the absence of these skills can have deadly consequences. January 29th, 2022 was a Saturday night in Oswego County, the kind of winter evening when most sensible people stayed home with their families, perhaps watching movies or playing board games while the wind howled outside their windows. The temperature was well below freezing, and the roads were treacherous with a combination of snow, ice, and the kind of slush that makes driving both difficult and dangerous. For Rebecca Fink and Juan Rivera, however, this was not a night for staying home. For reasons that may never be fully understood, they decided to venture out into the harsh winter conditions, with Rivera behind the wheel of his vehicle and Rebecca in the passenger seat. Perhaps they were returning from visiting friends or family. Maybe they had been out for dinner, or possibly they were simply restless and decided to take a drive, despite the weather condition. The decision to travel on that particular night would prove to be fatal, but not because of the weather conditions that made the roads dangerous. The real threat to Rebecca's safety was not the ice on the pavement or the snow that limited visibility. It was the man sitting beside her in the driver's seat, a man who was apparently capable of violence that would shock even experienced law enforcement officers. Rivera was driving his vehicle on Tubbs Road in the town of Mexico, a rural route that winds through agricultural areas and small residential properties. This is not a heavily traveled road, especially on a winter night, and drivers can often go for miles without encountering other vehicles. The isolation that makes these roads peaceful during pleasant weather can become dangerous during emergencies, when help might be miles away and response times can be measured in tens of minutes rather than seconds. As Rivera navigated the treacherous road conditions, something went wrong with his driving. Whether he was traveling too fast for the conditions, was distracted by a conversation with Rebecca, or simply misjudged the road surface, his vehicle left the roadway and collided with a utility pole. The impact was significant enough to damage the vehicle and bring it to a stop, but not severe enough to prevent Rivera from continuing to drive later. Car accidents on winter nights are unfortunately common in central New York, and most of them result in nothing more serious than property damage, insurance claims, and inconvenience. Drivers exchange information, call for towing services, and arrange for alternative transportation home. Even when vehicles are significantly damaged, the primary concerns are usually practical rather than life-threatening. How to get home, how to file insurance claims, and how to arrange for repairs. For Rebecca and Juan, however, the accident on Tubbs Road became the catalyst for a series of events that would end with Rebecca's death. After the collision with the pole, Rebecca exited the vehicle, possibly to assess the damage, to check on Rivera's condition, or simply to get some fresh air after the shock of the impact. This decision to get out of the car, which would have seemed perfectly reasonable under normal circumstances, put her in a position of vulnerability that Rivera would exploit in the most horrific way possible. What happened next between Rebecca and Juan in those crucial minutes after the accident represents one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. According to the investigation that would follow, they became involved in what authorities described as a domestic dispute. The exact nature of this dispute, what triggered it, what was said, how it escalated, remains known only to Rivera, since Rebecca is no longer able to tell her side of the story. Domestic disputes can arise from countless sources of tension: financial stress, relationship problems, disagreements about practical matters, or deeper issues of control and power within relationships. In healthy relationships, couples find ways to resolve these disputes through communication, compromise, or simply agreeing to disagree. But in relationships where one partner has a tendency toward violence or control, disputes can escalate rapidly from verbal arguments to physical confrontation. A remote location of this dispute, on a rural road on a winter night with no witnesses nearby, created conditions that allowed Rivera to act without fear of immediate intervention. There were no neighbors to call police, no passers-by to serve as witnesses, and no immediate consequences for whatever actions he might choose to take. This isolation that might have seemed romantic or peaceful under different circumstances became a trap that prevented Rebecca from getting help when she needed it most. As the dispute between Rebecca and Juan escalated, Rivera made a decision that transformed him from someone involved in a relationship conflict into a cold-blooded killer. Rather than finding a way to resolve their disagreement or simply walking away from the argument, he chose to use his vehicle as a weapon against the woman he had claimed to care about. Rivera got back into his damaged vehicle, started the engine, and deliberately drove into Rebecca, running her over with the full weight of the automobile. This was not an accident, not a moment of lost control, but a calculated decision to use deadly force against someone who is smaller, weaker, and completely vulnerable to his attack. The impact of the vehicle against Rebecca's body caused severe injuries that would ultimately prove fatal. But Rivera's actions that night went beyond even this horrific act of violence. After running Rebecca over, he got out of the vehicle and moved her severely injured body, placing her back in the passenger seat. This action demonstrates a level of calculation and awareness that makes his subsequent behavior even more disturbing. He knew that he had grievously injured her. He knew that she needed immediate medical attention, and he knew that his actions had been criminal. After placing Rebecca's broken body back in the passenger seat of his damaged vehicle, Juan Rivera made another calculated decision that would further seal his fate and eliminate any possibility that his actions could be viewed as accidental or impulsive. Rather than calling for emergency medical assistance for Rebecca, rather than driving directly to the nearest hospital, and rather than taking any action that might have saved her life, Rivera chose to flee the scene of his crime. The decision to leave the scene of an accident, resulting in serious injury or death, is itself a serious crime in New York State. But Rivera's actions went far beyond the typical hit-and-run case. He had not accidentally struck a pedestrian or another vehicle, and then panicked about the consequences. He had deliberately used his vehicle to attack his girlfriend, had placed her dying body in his car, and was now attempting to escape accountability for his actions. Rivera drove his damaged vehicle away from Tubbs Road, carrying Rebecca's severely injured body with him as he navigated the dark, icy roads of rural Oswego County. The exact route he took and his thought process during this flight are known only to him, but his destination suggests that he was not thinking clearly about how to avoid detection or consequences for his actions. Rather than driving to a remote location where he might have disposed of evidence or attempted to cover up his crime, Rivera ended up on West Stone Road in the town of New Haven, where he parked on the side of the road. This location was not particularly secluded, and his damaged vehicle would have been visible to anyone who happened to pass by. The decision to stop there, rather than continuing to flee or seeking help for Rebecca, suggests either panic, exhaustion, or a complete lack of understanding about the gravity of his situation. The discovery of Rivera and Rebecca came when an Oswego County Sheriff's deputy encountered the parked vehicle on West Stone Road. The deputy, probably conducting routine patrol duties on that winter nights, noticed the damaged car and stopped to investigate what might have been a routine traffic incident or mechanical breakdown. What the deputy found instead was a scene that would haunt him for years to come. Rebecca was still in the passenger seat, barely clinging to life after the brutal attack she had endured. The extent of her injuries would have been immediately apparent to the experienced deputy, who would have recognized that he was dealing with a medical emergency of the highest priority. Emergency medical services were called immediately, and Rebecca was rushed to the nearest hospital with trauma capabilities. The discovery of Rebecca's condition and Rivera's presence at the scene immediately transformed what had initially appeared to be a routine traffic stop into a potential homicide investigation. The deputy would have secured the scene, called for backup and investigative support, and begun the process of documenting evidence that would eventually be used to prosecute Rivera for his crimes. Rivera's behavior when confronted by law enforcement is not fully documented in the available reports, but his presence at the scene with Rebecca's dying body in his vehicle made it impossible for him to deny involvement in her injuries. The physical evidence, the damaged vehicle, Rebecca's condition, and the location where they were found would have immediately raised questions about what had happened and how Rebecca had sustained such severe injuries. The race to save Rebecca's life began immediately when emergency medical services arrived on West Stone Road. Paramedics and emergency medical technicians worked to stabilize her condition and prepare her for transport to the hospital. But the extent of her injuries made the prognosis grave from the beginning. The kind of trauma caused by being struck by a motor vehicle often results in internal injuries, broken bones, and organ damage that are difficult to treat even under the best circumstances. Rebecca was transported to Upstate University Hospital, a major medical center in Syracuse that serves as the trauma center for much of central New York. The hospital's emergency room staff and trauma surgeons would have immediately recognized the severity of her condition and mobilized all available resources to try to save her life. For several days, Rebecca fought for her life in the hospital, while her family maintained a bedside vigil and medical professionals did everything possible to treat her injuries. The specific nature of her medical treatments and the efforts made to save her life are private medical information, but the fact that she survived for several days after the attack suggests that the medical team was able to stabilize her initially and provide supportive care. During those critical days when Rebecca was fighting for her life, law enforcement investigators were working to piece together the events that had led to her injuries. The discovery of the scene on Tubbs Road where the initial accident had occurred, combined with witness statements and physical evidence, began to paint a picture of what had happened on that terrible night. The investigation revealed details that made Rivera's actions even more disturbing. Evidence at the scene on Tubbs Road confirmed that an accident had occurred there, but it also showed signs of the domestic dispute and the deliberate act of violence that had followed. Investigators were able to piece together a timeline that showed Rivera had made conscious, deliberate decisions at multiple points that had led to Rebecca's injuries and his subsequent flight from the scene. The news of Rebecca's condition and the circumstances surrounding her injuries began to spread through the tight-knit communities of Oswego County. Friends and family members gathered at the hospital to support each other and to hope for Rebecca's recovery, while law enforcement continued to build the case against Rivera for his actions. The days that Rebecca Fink spent in Upstate University Hospital fighting for her life were marked by a mixture of hope, desperation, and the gradual realization that her injuries were too severe for her to survive. The medical team treating her would have exhausted every possible intervention, utilizing the most advanced trauma care techniques available to try to save a life that had been so brutally threatened. Rebecca's family members, her parents, siblings, and close friends maintained a constant presence at the hospital during those critical days. These are the kinds of moments when families discover reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. When ordinary people find themselves navigating the complex world of intensive care units, medical terminology, and life and death decisions that no one is ever fully prepared to make. The waiting rooms and corridors of trauma centers like Upstate University Hospital are familiar with scenes of families in crisis, but each individual tragedy brings its own unique pain and challenges. Rebecca's loved ones would have been dealing not only with the medical uncertainty surrounding her condition, but also with the emotional trauma of learning how she had been injured, and the knowledge that someone they had trusted had been responsible for her suffering. The medical team caring for Rebecca would have provided regular updates to her family about her condition, her response to treatment, and the realistic prognosis for her recovery. These conversations between doctors and family members are among the most difficult in medicine, requiring healthcare professionals to balance honest communication about serious injuries with sensitivity to the emotional needs of people who are dealing with unthinkable circumstances. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that Rebecca's injuries were too extensive for her to survive. The trauma caused by being struck by a motor vehicle, combined with the delay in receiving medical treatment due to Rivera's decision to flee the scene, had caused damage that even the most skilled medical professionals could not repair. The decision-making process surrounding end-of-life care is always complex and emotionally devastating, but it becomes even more difficult when the patient's condition is the result of a deliberate criminal act. Rebecca's family had to navigate not only their grief and the medical realities of her condition, but also their anger and desire for justice regarding the actions that had brought them to this point. On January 31st, 2022, just 2 days after the attack that had left her fighting for her life, Rebecca Fink died from her injuries. Her death marked not only the end of a life that had held promise and potential, but also the transformation of Rivera's charges from assault and reckless endangerment to homicide. The moment of Rebecca's death would have been devastating for her family and friends, marking the end of their hopes for her recovery and the beginning of a grief process that would last for years. The loss of a 35-year-old woman to preventable violence represents not just individual tragedy, but a broader social failure, a reminder that domestic violence continues to claim lives despite decades of awareness campaigns and legal reforms. For the medical staff who had cared for Rebecca during her final days, her death would have represented both professional disappointments and personal sorrow. Healthcare workers who specialize in trauma care understand that they cannot save every patient, but cases involving young victims of violent crime are particularly difficult for medical professionals who entered their field to preserve life and reduce suffering. The official pronouncement of Rebecca's death triggered a series of legal and administrative processes that would eventually lead to Rivera's prosecution for murder. The medical examiner would have conducted an autopsy to document the specific injuries that caused her death, providing crucial evidence for the criminal case that was already being built against her killer. The notification of Rebecca's death to her extended family, friends, and community members spread waves of grief and shock throughout Oswego County. The news that a local woman had died as a result of domestic violence committed by her boyfriend resonated particularly strongly in small communities where everyone knows everyone else and where such tragedies feel both shocking and personal. Rebecca's obituary, published in local newspapers and online memorial sites, described her as someone who had been loved by many people and who had made positive contributions to her community during her 35 years of life. These memorial notices serve not only to inform the community about funeral arrangements, but also to preserve memories of the person who has been lost and to celebrate the positive aspects of their life. The funeral home services for Rebecca provided an opportunity for her community to come together to mourn her loss and to support her family during their time of grief. These gatherings serve important social functions, allowing people to express their condolences, share memories, and begin the process of collective healing that follows traumatic losses. The burial of Rebecca Fink in a local cemetery created a permanent memorial to her life and a place where her loved ones could visit to remember her and to find some measure of peace. The gravestone that marks her resting place serves as a lasting reminder of a life that was cut short by violence and of the ongoing need for society to address the root causes of domestic abuse. With Rebecca's death confirmed and Rivera in custody, the Oswego County Sheriff's Office launched a comprehensive investigation into the events of January 20. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case based on Rivera's presence at the scene with Rebecca's injured body became a complex investigation that would take months to complete and would reveal disturbing details about the calculated nature of his actions. The Criminal Investigations Division of the Sheriff's Office assigned experienced detectives to the case, understanding that the prosecution of a homicide requires meticulous documentation of evidence and thorough investigation of all aspects of the crime. These investigators had handled domestic violence cases before, but the particular brutality of Rebecca's death and the fact that Rivera had used his vehicle as a weapon made this case especially challenging and disturbing. The investigation began with a detailed examination of the scene on Tubbs Road where the initial accident had occurred and where Rivera had subsequently attacked Rebecca. Crime scene technicians photographed and measured every aspect of the location, documenting tire tracks, damage to the utility pole, and any other physical evidence that might help establish exactly what had happened during those crucial minutes. The damage to Rivera's vehicle provided important evidence about both the initial accident and the subsequent attack on Rebecca. Forensic examination of the car revealed not only the impact damage from the collision with the utility pole, but also evidence consistent with the vehicle having struck a human being. This physical evidence would prove crucial in establishing that Rivera had deliberately used his car as a weapon against Rebecca. The investigators also had to piece together the timeline of events, from the initial accident on Tubbs Road to Rivera's eventual discovery on West Stone Road, with Rebecca's dying body. This reconstruction required careful analysis of the route Rivera had taken, the time that had elapsed between the accident and his discovery by the deputy, and the actions he had taken during that period. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation involved attempts to locate witnesses who might have seen Rivera and Rebecca on the night of January 29th, or who might have encountered them at various points during the evening. In rural areas like Oswego County, potential witnesses can be few and far between, but even a single person who had interacted with the couple could provide crucial information about their relationship dynamics and Rivera's state of mind. The investigation revealed that there had been at least one potential witness to the events on Tubbs Road, a Good Samaritan who had stopped to help after seeing the accident, but before Rivera's attack on Rebecca escalated. This witness, who had not initially been identified, became a crucial focus of the investigation as authorities worked to locate them and obtain their testimony about what they had observed. Investigators appealed to the public for information about this unknown Good Samaritan, Understanding that their testimony could provide crucial details about the condition of both Rivera and Rebecca immediately after the accident and about the circumstances that had led to the domestic dispute. The fact that someone had stopped to help but had left before the violence occurred created both an opportunity to gather additional evidence and a source of frustration for investigators who needed every possible piece of information. The forensic analysis of Rivera's vehicle extended beyond just the physical damage to include examination of the interior for evidence of Rebecca's presence and any indications of violence that might have occurred inside the car. This analysis included testing for DNA, fingerprints, and any other trace evidence that might help establish the sequence of events and Rivera's actions after the attack. Digital evidence also played a role in the investigation, as detectives examined cell phone records, GPS data, and any other electronic information that might help establish the timeline of events in the locations where Rivera and Rebecca had been throughout the evening. Modern investigations increasingly rely on digital forensics to provide precise timelines and location data that can corroborate or contradict witness statements and suspect accounts. The background investigation into Rivera's history became an important component of building the prosecution's case. Investigators looked into his criminal record, his history of domestic violence, his relationship with Rebecca, and any other factors that might help explain his actions on January 29th or establish patterns of behavior that were relevant to the case. Similarly, investigators worked to understand Rebecca's background and her relationship with Rivera, not to assign blame to the victim, but to develop a complete picture of their relationship dynamics and any factors that might have contributed to the events of that night. This aspect of the investigation was conducted with sensitivity to Rebecca's family and with an understanding that domestic violence victims are never responsible for the actions of their abusers. The investigation also involved coordination with the medical examiner's office to ensure that the autopsy findings were properly documented and that the cause and manner of Rebecca's death were established with the scientific precision necessary for successful prosecution. The medical evidence would need to clearly establish that her injuries were consistent with being struck by a motor vehicle, and that these injuries were the direct cause of her death. As the investigation progressed over several months, detectives compiled a comprehensive case file that documented every aspect of the crime and established a clear narrative of Rivera's actions from the initial accident through Rebecca's death and his eventual arrest. This thorough investigation would prove crucial when the case eventually went to trial and prosecutors needed to present a compelling and complete account of the events to a jury. On July 13, 2022, nearly 6 months after Rebecca Fink's death, Juan Rivera was formally arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies related to his actions on January. The delay between Rebecca's death and Rivera's arrest was not unusual for a complex homicide investigation, as prosecutors and investigators needed time to compile all the evidence and ensure that the charges filed were supported by proof that would stand up in court. Rivera, 47 years old and a resident of Fulton, New York, was charged with manslaughter in the second degree, leaving the scene of an incident resulting in death, and aggravated unlicensed operation of a motor vehicle in the second degree. These charges reflected both the direct violence he had committed against Rebecca and his subsequent attempts to avoid accountability for his actions. The charge of manslaughter in the second degree is a serious felony in New York State that applies when someone recklessly causes the death of another person. While not as severe as murder in the first or second degree, manslaughter charges still carry significant penalties and reflect the prosecution's assessment that Rivera's actions, while perhaps not premeditated, were nevertheless criminally reckless and resulted in Rebecca's death. The charge of leaving the scene of an incident resulting in death specifically addressed Rivera's decision to flee from Tubbs Road after attacking Rebecca, rather than remaining at the scene to provide aid or call for emergency medical assistance. This charge recognizes that his failure to seek immediate help for Rebecca may have contributed to her death by delaying the medical treatment that might have saved her life. The aggravated unlicensed operation charge indicated that Rivera had been driving without a valid license at the time of the incident, adding another layer of legal culpability to his actions. While this charge was relatively minor compared to the homicide-related offenses, it demonstrated a pattern of disregard for legal requirements and social responsibility. Rivera's arrest took place without incident, suggesting that he had not been attempting to flee or evade law enforcement during the months-long investigation. His cooperation with the arrest process, however, did not indicate any acknowledgement of responsibility for Rebecca's death or any expression of remorse for his actions. The arraignment process, where Rivera appeared before a judge to be formally notified of the charges against him and to enter an initial plea, took place in Oswego County Sheriff Court. These proceedings are typically brief and procedural, focusing on ensuring that the defendant understands the charges and establishing conditions for release or detention pending trial. During the arraignment, prosecutors would have presented a summary of the evidence against Rivera and argued for appropriate bail conditions based on the severity of the charges and any perceived flight risk. The prosecution likely emphasized the violent nature of the crime and Rivera's decision to flee the scene as factors that warranted either detention without bail or the setting of a very high bail amount. Rivera's defense attorney would have entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, as is standard practice in serious criminal cases. The defense would also have had the opportunity to argue for reasonable bail conditions and to challenge any prosecution requests for detention or extremely high bail amounts. The judge's decision regarding bail would have been based on multiple factors, including the severity of the charges, Rivera's ties to the community, his criminal history, and the likelihood that he would appear for future court proceedings. Given the serious nature of the charges and the evidence that he had already fled one scene, the judge likely set bail at a substantial amount or ordered him held without bail. The news of Rivera's arrest brought some measure of relief to Rebecca's family and friends, who had been waiting for months to see formal charges filed in connection with her death. While no legal proceeding could bring Rebecca back or fully address the trauma of losing her, the arrest represented an important step toward accountability and justice. The local media coverage of Rivera's arrest helped to inform the broader community about the case and the charges he was facing. This coverage also served to keep Rebecca's memory alive in the public consciousness and to remind residents about the serious nature of domestic violence and its potential consequences. Following his arraignment, Rivera was either detained in the Oswego County Jail pending trial or released on bail with conditions designed to protect the public and ensure his appearance at future court proceedings. If released, he would likely have been prohibited from contacting Rebecca's family members and from engaging in any behavior that might intimidate witnesses or interfere with the prosecution of the case. The pretrial phase of the case would involve extensive discovery, as Rivera's defense team reviewed the evidence collected by investigators and prepared their strategy for defending against the charges. This process could take many months, as both sides worked to understand the full scope of the evidence and to prepare for trial. The death of Rebecca Fink and the subsequent arrest of Juan Rivera sent shockwaves through the close-knit communities of Oswego County, where residents were forced to confront the reality that domestic violence could occur anywhere and could escalate to deadly consequences even in places that felt safe and secure. The case became a catalyst for important conversations about relationship violence, warning signs, and the resources available to help people who find themselves in dangerous situations. Local domestic violence organizations used Rebecca's case as an opportunity to educate the community about the dynamics of abusive relationships and the particular dangers faced by women who are in the process of leaving or confronting abusive partners. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims is often when they attempt to leave relationships or when they confront their abusers about unacceptable behavior. The Oswego County Women's Shelter and other victim services organizations reported increased calls for information and assistance in the months following Rebecca's death, suggesting that her case had prompted other women to seek help for their own situations or to reach out on behalf of friends or family members who might be in danger. Educational programs in local schools began to incorporate discussions about healthy relationships and domestic violence prevention, recognizing that many patterns of abuse begin in teenage relationships, and that early intervention and education can help prevent future tragedies. These programs aim to teach young people to recognize warning signs of controlling or abusive behavior, and to understand that violence is never an acceptable response to relationship conflicts. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region used Rebecca's case as a training opportunity, examining the investigation techniques that had been used and the lessons that could be learned for handling similar cases in the future. The case highlighted the importance of thorough scene investigation, the value of forensic evidence in domestic violence prosecutions, and the need for coordinated responses between multiple agencies. Healthcare providers in the area also used the case as an opportunity to review their protocols for identifying and responding to domestic violence victims. Emergency room staff, primary care physicians, and other healthcare workers received training on how to recognize signs of abuse, how to safely document injuries that might be evidence of violence, and how to connect victims with appropriate resources and support services. The case also prompted discussions about the particular challenges faced by rural communities in responding to domestic violence incidents. The isolation that characterizes much of Oswego County can make it difficult for victims to seek help, and can delay law enforcement response times during emergencies. Community leaders began exploring ways to improve communication systems and response protocols for remote areas. Faith communities throughout the region also grappled with Rebecca's death, using the tragedy as an opportunity to examine their own roles in supporting families in crisis and preventing violence within their congregations. Many churches and religious organizations began offering educational programs about healthy relationships and created support networks for individuals who might be experiencing domestic violence. The ripple effects of Rebecca's death extended beyond formal organizations to informal networks of friends, neighbors, and co-workers who began to pay closer attention to the relationships around them. People reported being more willing to check in on friends who seemed isolated or stressed, and more aware of warning signs that might indicate someone was in an abusive relationship. Memorial services and remembrance events for Rebecca provided opportunities for the community to come together in grief and solidarity. These gatherings served not only to honor her memory, but also to strengthen the social bonds that help communities heal from trauma and work together to prevent future tragedies. The establishment of scholarship funds and charitable donations in Rebecca's name created lasting ways for the community to remember her, while supporting causes that might help prevent similar tragedies. These memorials transformed individual grief into collective action and ensured that Rebecca's death would continue to have meaning and impact long after the immediate crisis had passed. The legal proceedings against Juan Rivera moved through the court system with the methodical pace that characterizes serious criminal cases, as both prosecutors and defense attorneys worked to prepare their arguments and gather evidence for what would eventually become a complex trial involving multiple charges and serious penalties. The discovery phase of the case involved the exchange of evidence between prosecution and defense teams, including police reports, forensic analysis results, witness statements, and medical records related to Rebecca's injuries and death. This process allowed both sides to understand the strength of the evidence and to develop their respective strategies for trial. Plea negotiations, which are common in criminal cases, likely took place between prosecutors and Rivera's defense team as they attempted to reach a resolution that would avoid the uncertainty and expense of a full trial. These discussions would have involved careful consideration of the strength of the evidence, the severity of the charges, and the potential penalties Rivera faced if convicted. The prosecution's case was built around the physical evidence from the crime scene, the medical evidence regarding Rebecca's injuries, and the timeline of events that investigators had reconstructed. The fact that Rivera had been found with Rebecca's dying body in his vehicle, combined with the evidence of the domestic dispute and his decision to flee the scene, created a compelling narrative of guilt that would be difficult for the defense to overcome. Rivera's defense team faced the challenging task of either disputing the prosecution's version of events or arguing for mitigating circumstances that might reduce the severity of the charges or penalties. Given the strength of the physical evidence, the defense likely focused on challenging the prosecution's characterization of Rivera's intent and mental state during the incident. The case eventually reached a resolution through plea negotiations, with Rivera agreeing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a specific sentencing agreement. While the exact terms of this plea agreement are not detailed in available records, such agreements typically involve the defendant accepting responsibility for their actions in exchange for some degree of certainty about their punishment. Rivera's guilty plea meant that Rebecca's family was spared the trauma of a lengthy trial during which they would have had to hear detailed testimony about her final moments and the violence she had endured. Plea agreements, while sometimes frustrating to victims' families who want full accountability, can provide closure and certainty that trials cannot always guarantee. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Rebecca's family members to address the court and Rivera directly, sharing victim impact statements that described the profound loss they had suffered and the ongoing effects of her death on their lives. These statements serve important functions in the criminal justice process, ensuring that the human cost of crime is acknowledged and considered in determining appropriate punishment. Rivera's sentencing reflected the serious nature of his crimes and the devastating impact of his actions on Rebecca's family and community. While no sentence could restore Rebecca's life or fully address the trauma her loved ones had experienced, the penalty imposed served as both punishment for his actions and a deterrent to others who might consider similar violence. The conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter in the aftermath of Rebecca's death, but not the end of her family's grief or the community's process of healing. Legal resolution, while important for establishing accountability, cannot undo the fundamental injustice of a life lost to preventable violence. Rebecca Fink's death serves as a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences that can result when domestic disputes escalate to violence, particularly in situations where isolation and the availability of weapons create conditions for deadly outcomes. Her case illustrates several important lessons about domestic violence, relationship safety, the need for comprehensive community responses to intimate partner abuse. One of the most significant aspects of Rebecca's case is the role that isolation played in enabling Rivera's violence against her. The remote location where the domestic dispute occurred meant that there were no immediate witnesses to intervene, no neighbors to call for help, and no quick access to emergency services that might have prevented the escalation to deadly force. This isolation factor is particularly relevant for rural communities like those in Oswego County, where geographic distances and sparse population density can create vulnerabilities for domestic violence victims. The case highlights the need for rural communities to develop specialized strategies for preventing and responding to intimate partner violence that account for these unique challenges. The use of a vehicle as a weapon in Rebecca's death also represents a particularly dangerous form of domestic violence that can occur when abusers have access to automobiles and the opportunity to use them against their victims. This type of violence can be especially deadly because of the significant force involved and the difficulty of escaping from a vehicle attack. Rebecca's case demonstrates the importance of recognizing that domestic violence can escalate rapidly from verbal arguments to deadly force, particularly in situations where the abuser feels cornered, embarrassed, or challenged. The initial car accident that brought Rivera and Rebecca to Tubbs Road may have created stress and tension that contributed to the escalation of their disputes. But it was Rivera's choice to respond with violence that transformed a difficult situation into a tragedy. The Good Samaritan who stopped to help after the initial accident but left before Rivera's attack on Rebecca represents both an opportunity that was missed and a reminder of the unpredictable nature of domestic violence escalation. This person's presence might have prevented Rivera from attacking Rebecca, but their departure created the conditions that allowed the violence to occur. The case also illustrates the devastating ripple effects that domestic violence homicides have on families, friends, and entire communities. Rebecca's death affected not only her immediate family but also her broader social network, her community, and the first responders and healthcare workers who encountered her case. From a criminal justice perspective, Rebecca's case demonstrates the importance of thorough investigation techniques and the value of physical evidence in prosecuting domestic violence cases. The forensic evidence from the crime scene and Rivera's vehicle provided crucial proof of his actions that might have been difficult to establish through witness testimony alone. The case also highlights the importance of treating domestic violence as a serious crime deserving of significant legal consequences. Rivera's prosecution and sentencing sent a message to the community that intimate partner violence would not be tolerated and that those who commit such acts would be held accountable. Rebecca's legacy extends beyond the legal resolution of her case to include the awareness her death raised about domestic violence and the changes it prompted in her community's approach to preventing and responding to intimate partner abuse. Her death became a catalyst for education, prevention efforts, and support services that may have helped other potential victims avoid similar fates. As we come to the end of Rebecca Fink's story, it's important to remember that behind the details of investigation, legal proceedings, and community response was a real person whose life held value, meaning, and potential. Rebecca was not just a victim of domestic violence. She was a daughter, sister, friend, and community member who deserved to live a full life free from violence and fear. At 35 years old, Rebecca had decades of life ahead of her when Rivera's actions cut her story short. She had dreams, relationships, and contributions yet to make to her community and the world. Her death represents not only the loss of who she was, but also the loss of who she might have become and all the positive impacts she might have had on others' lives. The tragedy of domestic violence, homicides like Rebecca's, is that they are largely preventable. With better recognition of warning signs, improved intervention services, and a cultural commitment to rejecting violence in intimate relationships, many of these deaths could be avoided. For listeners who may be in relationships where they feel unsafe or controlled, Rebecca's story serves as a reminder that help is available and that no one deserves to live in fear of their partner. Domestic violence hotlines, shelters, counseling services, and legal advocacy programs exist to provide support and assistance to those who need help leaving dangerous relationships. The warning signs of potentially abusive relationships include controlling behavior, isolation from friends and family, threats of violence, destruction of property, extreme jealousy, and attempts to monitor or restrict a partner's activities. These behaviors often escalate over time and can become deadly if not addressed. For friends and family members who are concerned about someone in their life, Rebecca's case demonstrates the importance of maintaining connections with potential victims and being prepared to offer support and resources when they are ready to seek help. Often victims of domestic violence need multiple attempts and significant support to successfully leave abusive relationships. Community members can honor Rebecca's memory by supporting local domestic violence prevention and response organizations, advocating for policies that protect victims and hold abusers accountable, and working to change cultural attitudes that normalize or excuse intimate partner violence. The criminal justice system, while important for holding perpetrators accountable, cannot by itself solve the problem of domestic violence. Prevention requires comprehensive community efforts that address the root causes of intimate partner abuse and provide support systems that help both victims and perpetrators change destructive patterns of behavior. As you settle into sleep tonight, take a moment to remember Rebecca Fink, not just as a victim of violence, but as a person whose life mattered and whose death continues to teach important lessons about the need to protect and support one another. Her story reminds us that domestic violence can affect anyone in any community, and that we all have a role to play in preventing these tragedies. Let Rebecca's memory serve as a call to action, to be more aware of the relationships around us, to speak out against violence and control in intimate partnerships, and to support those who may be struggling in dangerous situations. In doing so, we honor not only Rebecca's legacy, but also our shared commitment to creating communities where everyone can live safely and without fear. The snow has long since melted from the roads of Oswego County, where Rebecca took her final ride, but her memory remains as a reminder of the precious nature of life and the responsibility we all share to protect and care for one another. May she rest in peace, and may her story continue to inspire efforts to prevent domestic violence and support those who have been affected by intimate partner abuse. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 3. The autumn evening of October 10, 2011, started like any other in the quiet Morgan Park neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The leaves were beginning to turn, painting the residential streets in warm shades of amber and gold. She never came home. Latasha's story begins not with her disappearance, but with her dreams. Here was a young woman determined to build a better life for herself and her family. She was a devoted mother to 3 children, 10-year-old Ariel and her 2-year-old twin boys Brian and Ryan. While caring for her young family, Latasha had enrolled at Evergreen University, pursuing her goal of becoming a dental hygienist. By all accounts, she was on the right track. Her studies were going well, her relationship with her children was strong, and she had a clear vision for her future. Those who knew Latasha described her as someone who doted on her children. She wasn't the type of person to simply vanish without a trace, especially not someone who would abandon her babies. Her mother, Brenda Morgan, would later tell investigators with certainty, "I just don't see her walking away from life. Just walking away from her kids like that." This sentiment would echo through every conversation about Latasha. She was a mother first, and mothers don't just disappear. The evening of October 10th seemed ordinary enough. Latasha and Isaac were at home with the twins. Little Brian and Ryan, just 2 years old and still needing constant attention. Ariel, Latasha's oldest daughter, was staying with her grandparents, as she often did. It was around 9 p.m. when Latasha decided to make the trip to the store. In many neighborhoods, a woman walking alone at night might raise immediate concerns. But this was her community. She knew these streets, knew the rhythms of her neighborhood. The store wasn't far, just a few blocks away on 112th Street, a straight shot from their home on West 10th. Isaac would later tell police that he'd expected her back within 30 minutes, maybe 45 at most. It was a simple trip, in and out. But as the minutes ticked by and turned into hours, his concern began to grow. According to Isaac, they had exchanged text messages initially, but then her responses suddenly stopped. Her phone went silent. The texts, he claimed, had automatically erased from his phone, a detail that would later raise questions among investigators and the public alike. But here's where the story takes its first troubling turn. Despite his growing concern, despite the fact that his wife, the mother of his 2 toddlers, had failed to return from what should have been a brief errand. Isaac didn't immediately call the police. He didn't call that night or the next day or the day after that. It wasn't until October 14th, 4 full days after Latasha had walked out their front door, that Isaac Nevitt finally contacted the Chicago Police Department to report his wife missing. When the police arrived to take the missing person report, they found no signs of struggle in the Nevitt home. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no blood, nothing to suggest that anything violent had occurred within those walls. Isaac's explanation for the delay was that he had hoped she would return, that maybe she had gone to stay with family or friends and would come back when she was ready. But investigators found this reasoning troubling. This was a woman with 2 toddlers at home, a woman in the middle of her education, a woman with responsibilities and routines. People like that don't just disappear for 4 days without contact. The investigation began in earnest, and immediately suspicion fell on the person who statistically is most often responsible when a woman goes missing, her husband. Domestic violence statistics tell us that intimate partners are responsible for the majority of violence against women, and investigators know to look closest to home first. Isaac Nevitt found himself under intense scrutiny, his every word analyzed, his behavior dissected, but Isaac maintained his innocence from the very beginning. More importantly, when detectives asked him to take a polygraph examination, he agreed without hesitation. The results were clear. Isaac Nevitt passed the polygraph test. While polygraph results aren't admissible in court and aren't 100% accurate, they're still a valuable investigative tool. The fact that Isaac passed raised questions about his involvement, or lack thereof, in his wife's disappearance. Meanwhile, Latasha's family was struggling with their own concerns and suspicions. The relationship between Latasha and her parents had been complicated, particularly when it came to her marriage to Isaac. There were whispers and allegations of domestic abuse, claims that Isaac was controlling and violent. Latasha's oldest daughter, Ariel, was living with her grandparents rather than with Latasha and Isaac, arrangement that raised questions about the family dynamics. When investigators interviewed Latasha's mother, Brenda Morgan, her behavior struck some as odd. She seemed unusually calm for a woman whose daughter had vanished. When police asked to search her home, Brenda's reaction was to laugh and make jokes about the situation, behavior that many found inappropriate given the circumstances. Some observers noted that she seemed more focused on directing suspicion toward Isaac than on expressing genuine concern for her missing daughter. The investigation expanded beyond the family. Police checked Latasha's bank accounts and found that she hadn't accessed them since October 10th. Her cell phone had gone silent that same night. There was no digital trail, no credit card usage, no sign that she was alive somewhere and simply choosing not to make contact. This suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either Latasha was being held against her will, or she was already dead. Investigators brought in search dogs to help locate any trace of Latasha. The dogs tracked her scent from the family home, following what appeared to be her path toward the store. The trail led through the neighborhood. But then something strange happened. The scent trail stopped abruptly at a small, empty lot near the corner of Ahers and 7th and Loomis, just a few blocks from the Nevitt home. The dogs couldn't pick up the trail beyond that point, as if Latasha had simply vanished into thin air from that spot. When investigators asked Latasha's family where they thought she might be found if something had happened to her, both her mother and another family member pointed to the same general area, the wooded lot where the dogs had lost her scent. This seemed like an odd coincidence to some observers. How would they know to point to that specific location unless they had some knowledge of what had happened there? As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the case grew cold. The Chicago Police Department, overwhelmed with cases in a city that sees hundreds of homicides annually, had limited resources to devote to a missing person case, where the person might have simply chosen to disappear. Isaac Nevitt found himself in the impossible position of being the primary suspect in his wife's disappearance, while simultaneously being the only person actively searching for her. He posted flyers throughout the neighborhood, contacted local media, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The strain on the family was immense. Isaac was left to care for the twin boys alone, while dealing with the constant suspicion of law enforcement in the community. Latasha's mother took custody of 10-year-old Ariel, and the family fractured under the weight of grief, suspicion, and unanswered questions. The children, too young to fully understand what had happened, kept asking when their mother would come home. For nearly 3 years, the case remained at a standstill. Latasha Nevitt was simply gone, as if she had walked out of her house that October evening and stepped into another dimension. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, just a missing woman and a family torn apart by her absence. Then on March 6, 2014, everything changed. A city water department worker named Marcus was conducting routine maintenance in the Morgan Park neighborhood. He was checking for leaks in the drainage system near the intersection of 10th and Loomis, the very area where the search dogs had lost Latasha's scent nearly 3 years earlier. As he lifted a manhole cover and peered into the drainage pipe below, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, in the narrow confines of the drainage system, was a heavy-duty plastic bag. Inside that bag was the decomposed remains of a human being, curled in the fetal position. The body had been frozen by the Chicago winter and was wrapped not just in the outer plastic bag but in multiple layers of garbage bags. Around the skull was a scarf, tied like a blindfold over where the eyes would have been. The legs were bound together with what appeared to be a cell phone charging cord. The discovery was made at approximately 10:45 a.m. on that March morning, less than 100 feet from the Nevitt family home. The location was exactly where the search dogs had lost Latasha's scent, exactly where her family members had pointed when asked where they thought she might be found. 2 days later, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Latasha Nevitt. She had been murdered, and her body had been concealed in the drainage system for nearly 2.5 years, through multiple Chicago winters and summers, through seasons of searching and hoping and grieving. The condition of the body told a horrific story. According to the medical examiner's report, Latasha had been frozen in the fetal position and wrapped in garbage bags. A scarf was wrapped around her eyes like a blindfold. Her legs were bound with a cell phone charging cord. The coroner classified her death as a homicide by unspecified means. The advanced state of decomposition made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death, but the manner in which the body was found, bound, blindfolded, and carefully concealed, spoke to a deliberate and calculated murder. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How long had Latasha been in that drainage pipe? Had she been killed immediately after disappearing, or had she been held captive somewhere else before being murdered and her body moved to this location? The blindfold suggested that she may have been alive when it was applied. Why blindfold someone who's already dead? The cell phone charging cord used to bind her legs was particularly puzzling. Whose cord was it? Why would Latasha have been carrying a charging cord with her on a simple trip to the store? The location of the body was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the discovery. The drainage pipe where Latasha was found was not easily accessible. It would have required knowledge of the area's infrastructure and considerable physical effort to place a body there. This wasn't a random dumping ground. It was a carefully chosen hiding place, selected by someone who knew the area well and understood that the body might remain hidden indefinitely. The fact that Latasha was found so close to her home, in the exact area where the search dogs had lost her scent, suggested that she had been attacked very close to where she disappeared. It's possible that she never made it to the store at all, that she was intercepted somewhere along her route and attacked in or near that empty lot where her scent trail ended. With the discovery of Latasha's body, the missing person case officially became a homicide investigation. But despite the intensive investigation that followed, no arrests were ever made. The case remains unsolved to this day, more than a decade after Latasha's disappearance, and nearly as long since her body was discovered. The investigation that followed the discovery of Latasha's remains focused heavily on the family dynamics and the timeline of events. Investigators looked closely at Isaac's behavior in the days following Latasha's disappearance, the 4-day delay in reporting her missing, and the family's knowledge of the area where she was found. They examined the possibility that this was a domestic violence situation that had escalated to murder, as well as the possibility that someone else in the family might have been involved. Isaac Nevitt continued to maintain his innocence throughout the investigation. His supporters pointed to the fact that he had passed a polygraph test, that he had been the one searching for Latasha and posting flyers, and that he had cooperated fully with the investigation. They argued that if he had killed his wife, he would have been more likely to dispose of the body far from home, not hide it just blocks from where they lived, where it was likely to eventually be discovered. However, critics noted the suspicious timing of Isaac's report to police, his claim that text messages had automatically deleted from his phone, and the fact that he had allowed his wife to walk alone to the store at night in an urban area. They questioned why he hadn't immediately gone looking for her when she failed to return, and why he had waited so long to involve law enforcement. The investigation also looks closely at Latasha's family, particularly given their apparent foreknowledge of where her body might be found. Some observers found it suspicious that family members had pointed to the exact area where Latasha was eventually discovered. Was this simply intuition, or did it suggest some kind of inside knowledge? There were also questions about the family dynamics and the custody arrangement for Latasha's oldest daughter. Why was Ariel living with her grandparents instead of with Latasha and Isaac? Were there legitimate concerns about abuse, or were there other factors at play? Some theorized that there may have been conflicts within the extended family about custody, money, or control that could have escalated to violence. Another line of investigation focused on the possibility that Latasha had been the victim of a random crime. The Morgan Park neighborhood, while generally quiet, was not immune to crime. It's possible that Latasha encountered a stranger while walking to the store, someone who attacked her for reasons that had nothing to do with her family situation. The binding and blindfolding of the victim could suggest a sexually motivated crime, or the work of someone who had committed similar attacks before. The fact that Latasha's body was found in such a specific and hard-to-access location suggested that whoever put her there had detailed knowledge of the area. This could point to someone from the neighborhood, possibly someone who had grown up in the area or worked in a capacity that would give them knowledge of the local infrastructure. City workers, utility employees, or longtime residents would be more likely to know about hidden or rarely accessed areas like the drainage pipe where Latasha's body was found. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly frustrated by the lack of physical evidence. The advanced state of decomposition meant that most forensic evidence had been lost. There was no DNA from an attacker, no fingerprints, no trace evidence that could point to a specific perpetrator. The cell phone charging cord and the scarf used to bind and blindfold Latasha were too decomposed to provide useful evidence. The case was further complicated by the passage of time. By the time Latasha's body was discovered, nearly 3 years had passed since her disappearance. Witnesses' memories had faded, security camera footage had been deleted, and potential evidence had been lost or destroyed. The investigation was essentially starting over, but with a significantly diminished chance of finding useful evidence. As years passed without an arrest, the case began to attract attention from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators. The case was featured on television shows, including the first 48 Missing Persons, which brought national attention to Latasha's story. Viewers and online sleuths began analyzing every detail of the case, debating the suspicious behaviors of various family members and developing their own theories about what had happened. The television coverage revealed additional details about the family dynamics that hadn't been previously reported. Viewers noted the seemingly odd behavior of Latasha's mother during police interviews, her apparent lack of emotion when discussing her daughter's disappearance, and her laughter when police asked to search her home. Some observers found this behavior more suspicious than Isaac's actions, leading to speculation that the investigation may have focused on the wrong suspect. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in investigating missing person cases, particularly in urban areas with high crime rates. The Chicago Police Department, dealing with hundreds of homicides and thousands of other violent crimes annually, had limited resources to devote to a case where the victim might have simply chosen to disappear. The 4-day delay in reporting Latasha missing meant that crucial early investigative opportunities were lost. Family members continued to speak out about the case in the years following the discovery of Latasha's body. In 2020, nearly 6 years after her remains were found, Latasha's family made emotional appeals for anyone with information to come forward. They spoke about the ongoing pain of not knowing who had killed Latasha or why, and their frustration with the lack of progress in the investigation. 9 years later, the family of Latasha Nevitt, whose body was found in Morgan Park 6 years ago, still do not have answers as to how she died, reported ABC7 Chicago in 2020. The family's plea highlighted the ongoing nature of their grief and their desperate need for closure. The impact on Latasha's children cannot be overstated. Ariel, who was 10 when her mother disappeared, had to grow up without knowing what happened to the woman who gave her life. The twin boys, Brian and Ryan, were too young when their mother vanished to have clear memories of her. They've grown up with only photographs and stories to help them understand who Latasha was and what she meant to those who loved her. Isaac Nevitt, despite the cloud of suspicion that has followed him for more than a decade, has remained in the Chicago area. Some see this as evidence of his innocence, arguing that a guilty person would have fled long ago. Others view his continued presence as part of an elaborate deception. The truth is that we simply don't know, and without new evidence or a confession, we may never know. The case has also highlighted the broader issues of missing persons cases involving African American women. Latasha's story is part of a disturbing pattern of cases involving black women who disappear and whose cases don't receive the same level of media attention or investigative resources as cases involving white victims. The Black and Missing Foundation and similar organizations have worked to raise awareness of these disparities and to ensure that all missing persons receive equal attention and resources. What makes Latasha's case particularly haunting is how ordinary it seemed at the beginning. A woman decides to walk to the store on an autumn evening to pick up some items. It's the kind of routine errand that millions of people do every day without incident. But somewhere between her front door and that store on 112th Street, Latasha Nevitt encountered evil. Whether that evil came in the form of a stranger lurking in the shadows, a family member harboring dark secrets, or her own husband hiding a violent nature, we may never know. The physical location where Latasha's body was found continues to haunt those familiar with the case. The drainage pipe near 107th and Loomis has been covered and secured, but residents of the neighborhood know what happened there. Some report feeling uneasy when walking past the area, knowing that for nearly 3 years, Latasha's remains lay hidden just beneath their feet as they went about their daily lives. The investigation into Latasha's murder remains officially open, but with each passing year, the likelihood of a resolution grows smaller. Witnesses age and die, memories fade further, and new cases demand the attention of investigators. The Chicago Police Department continues to encourage anyone with information about the case to come forward, but the leads have long since dried up. For the investigators who worked on the case, Latasha's murder represents one of those heartbreaking failures that haunt law enforcement officers throughout their careers. They had a victim, they had suspects, they had theories, but they couldn't put together the evidence needed to make an arrest. In a city where hundreds of murders occur each year, resources are limited, and not every case can be solved. But that statistical reality offers little comfort to the family members who continue to seek justice for Latasha. The case has also raised questions about the effectiveness of polygraph examinations in criminal investigations. Isaac's successful completion of the polygraph test has been cited by his supporters as evidence of his innocence. While critics note that polygraphs are notoriously unreliable and that sociopaths and trained individuals can sometimes pass them even when lying, the debate over the value of polygraph testing in criminal investigations continues, with Latasha's case serving as an example of the limitations of this investigative tool. As we consider Latasha's story more than a decade after her disappearance, we're left with more questions than answers. Was she the victim of domestic violence that escalated to murder? Was she attacked by a stranger while walking to the store? Did family dynamics and disputes over child custody lead to her death? Or was there some other motive and some other perpetrator that investigators never identified? The truth is that we may never know what happened to Latasha Nevitt in those final moments of her life. We don't know if she suffered, if she fought back, or if she had any idea what was about to happen to her. We don't know if her last thoughts were of her children, her dreams of becoming a dental hygienist, or simply the routine errand she was trying to complete. What we do know is that Latasha was more than just a victim or a cold case file. She was a mother who loved her children, a student working toward a better future, a daughter and sister and friend who was loved by many people. She had dreams and plans and hopes for tomorrow. All of that was stolen from her on that October evening in 2011, and the person responsible has never been held accountable. The case serves as a reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly violence can intrude into ordinary lives. Latasha was simply trying to make a quick trip to the store, the kind of errand that people make countless times without incident. But somewhere in those few blocks between her home and her destination, she encountered someone who changed the course of her life and the lives of everyone who loved her. For true crime enthusiasts who study cases like Latasha's, the story serves as a sobering reminder that not every mystery gets solved, not every victim gets justice, and not every family gets closure. Real-life investigations are messier and more complicated than television shows suggest. Evidence is often lacking, witnesses are unreliable, and sometimes the truth remains hidden forever. The people of Morgan Park continue to live their lives, walking the same streets where Latasha walked on her final night. Some remember her story and wonder what really happened. Others have moved on to more immediate concerns. But for those who knew and loved Latasha Nevitt, the questions persist, the grief endures, and the hope for justice, however faint, continues to flicker. In the end, Latasha's story is a tragedy without resolution, a mystery without solution, a family without closure. It's the story of a woman who deserved better, children who deserved to grow up with their mother, and a community that deserved to know the truth about what happened in their neighborhood on that autumn night. And the investigation remains open, the case remains unsolved, and somewhere out there, if they're still alive, the person responsible for Latasha's death continues to walk free. Perhaps they think about what they did on quiet nights, perhaps they've managed to forget, or perhaps they've convinced themselves that they were justified in their actions. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even after many years have passed. Until that day comes, if it ever does, Latasha Nevitt's story remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, the persistence of evil, and the enduring power of love that refuses to let go, even in the face of death and mystery. Her children continue to grow and live their lives, carrying pieces of their mother with them. Her family continues to hope for answers. And somewhere in the city of Chicago, the truth about what happened to Latasha Nevitt waits to be discovered. The case of Latasha Nevitt represents one of thousands of unsolved murders that occur in America each year. Her story is unique in its details, but tragically common in its outcome. A life was taken, a family was shattered, and justice has remained elusive. For those who believe that every life has value and every victim deserves justice, cases like Latasha serve as a call to action, to never give up searching for the truth, to never stop believing that even the coldest cases can be solved, and to never forget the real people behind the headlines and statistics. As this story comes to a close, it's important to remember that for Latasha's family, the story isn't over. They continue to live with unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and the hope that someday, somehow, they'll learn the truth about what happened to the woman they loved. Their pain is real, their loss is permanent, and their need for justice is as strong today as it was on that October night in 2011, when Latasha Nevitt walked out of her house and into a mystery that continues to haunt all who encounter her story. If you have any information about the disappearance and murder of Latasha Nevitt, please contact the Chicago Police Department at 312-747-8274. Even the smallest detail could be the key to finally solving this case and bringing justice to Latasha and her family. I honestly want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 4. The evening light was beginning to fade over the quiet Murray Hill neighborhood when 13-year-old Milana Lee last walked through the door of her family's apartment. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that carries the weight of Monday morning on its shoulders, when homework feels heavier and the weekend's freedom slips away like sand through fingers. For most families, it was an ordinary night. For the Lee family, it would be the last ordinary night they would ever know. Milana was the kind of girl who brightened rooms without trying. Her grandmother, Lydia Lee, would later recall with tears in her eyes how she never saw Milana angry, how the girl was always smiling, always saying, okay, grandma, with that gentle acceptance that seemed too wise for her 13 years. She was a 6th grader at Conestoga Middle School, navigating that awkward territory between childhood and adolescence with the same quiet grace that seemed to define everything about her. The Lee family had come to Oregon, seeking the American dream. Like so many immigrant families before them, they were hard-working people who believed in the safety of their adopted home, in the promise that if you worked hard and kept your head down, good things would come. Milana's mother worked nights, a common sacrifice made by parents trying to build a better life for their children. It meant long hours away from home, but it also meant trust. Trust in their community, trust in their neighborhood, trust that 13-year-old Milana would be safe. That trust would prove to be tragically misplaced When Monday, May 9th dawned gray and drizzling, typical Oregon spring weather, Milana Lee was nowhere to be found. Her mother had returned from her night shift expecting to find her daughter getting ready for school, perhaps running a little late as teenagers often do. Instead, she found an empty apartment and a growing knot of worry in her stomach that would only tighten as the hours passed. At first, like many parents in similar situations, there was that desperate hope that maybe this was just teenage rebellion. Maybe Milana had gone to school early, or maybe she'd stayed overnight at a friend's house without permission. These are the small lies we tell ourselves when the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. But as Monday wore on, and phone calls to friends and the school yielded nothing, that hope began to crumble. The Beaverton police were contacted, and Milana Lee was officially reported missing. In those early hours, investigators operated under the assumption that they were dealing with a runaway situation. 13-year-olds sometimes act impulsively. Sometimes they leave home over arguments, over grades, over the million small dramas that feel earth-shattering when you're 13. The statistics suggested this was most likely what they were dealing with. But Milana's family knew better. This wasn't like her. She wasn't the type to just disappear without a word. As news of her disappearance began to spread through the community, friends and neighbors began to organize search efforts. Social media posts circulated with her photo, a pretty girl with dark hair and a gentle smile, the kind of picture that makes strangers want to help, want to believe that everything will be okay. Throughout that Monday and into the evening, search parties combed the neighborhoods around Murray Hill. Volunteers checked parks, knocked on doors, peered into wooded areas where a scared 13-year-old might hide. The community came together in the way communities do when one of their children is missing, with a fierce protective energy that refuses to acknowledge the darker possibilities lurking at the edges of everyone's minds. Tuesday, May 10th, 2022, would bring an end to the desperate hope that had sustained the search efforts. A little more than 24 hours after Milana Lee had been reported missing, someone made a discovery that would shatter a family and shock a community. Westside Linear Park sits in South Beaverton, not far from where Milana lived. It's the kind of green space that defines Oregon communities, trees and walking paths, small streams that gurgle quietly through suburban landscapes. On any other day, it would have been peaceful, perhaps filled with joggers or dog walkers, enjoying the mild spring weather. On this day, it became a crime scene. Milana's body was found in a small stream that wound through the park. The discovery was made by someone who had likely joined the search efforts, someone who was hoping to find a frightened but alive 13-year-old hiding somewhere safe. Instead, they found something that would haunt them forever. The Beaverton police responded immediately, and the scene was secured. What they found there told a story that no parent should ever have to hear, no community should ever have to confront. This was not a runaway who had met with some tragic accident. This was not a case of a young girl who had gotten lost or hurt while trying to find her way home. This was murder. The evidence at the scene painted a horrific picture. Milana Lee had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The medical examiner would later confirm what investigators suspected. This 13-year-old girl had endured unspeakable violence in her final moments. She had been brutally attacked by someone who had shown her no mercy, no humanity, no recognition of her worth as a human being. The investigation immediately shifted from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. The FBI was called in to assist, bringing additional resources and expertise to bear on what was clearly a complex and serious crime. The community that had rallied together to search for Milana now found itself grappling with a different kind of reality. The knowledge that a predator had walked among them, had somehow gained access to one of their children. Homicide investigations are like puzzles, where most of the pieces are missing, and the ones you have don't seem to fit together at first. Detectives began the painstaking work of reconstructing Milana's final days, trying to understand how a 13-year-old girl who should have been safe in her own neighborhood ended up murdered in a local park. They started with the basics. Who had seen Milana last? Who were her friends? Did she have any conflicts with anyone? Was there anyone in her life who might have wanted to hurt her? These are standard questions in any homicide investigation, but they feel particularly brutal when the victim is a child. The investigators were not just trying to solve a crime. They were trying to understand how someone's baby sister, someone's classmate, someone's daughter had become the victim of such violence. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was carefully collected and analyzed. In modern criminal investigations, DNA evidence, fiber analysis, and other forensic techniques can provide crucial links between suspects and victims. But forensic evidence is only useful if you have something to compare it to, if you have suspects to test against. Meanwhile, the community was reeling. Parents held their children a little tighter, walked them to school instead of letting them walk alone, double-checked locks on doors and windows. The sense of safety that had defined their neighborhood was gone, replaced by a hypervigilance that would last long after the case was closed. Milana's family was struggling with grief that seemed incomprehensible. Her grandmother's words would later capture the depth of their pain. Pain. This pain is not possible to describe. You have to go through this pain. These are the words of someone whose world has been fundamentally altered. Someone trying to put language to a loss that defies description. 10 days after Milana's body was discovered, the investigation took a significant turn. On May 20, 2022, Beaverton police announced that they had arrested a suspect in connection with her murder. The suspect was a 16-year-old boy, a juvenile whose name was initially withheld from the public due to his age. This arrest sent shockwaves through the community for several reasons. First, the suspect was young, just 16 years old, only 3 years older than Milana herself. Second, and perhaps more disturbing, this was not a stranger who had randomly targeted Milana. The suspect was someone who lived in the same community, someone who would have been familiar with the area, someone who might have even known Milana or her family. As more details emerged, the picture became even more troubling. The suspect, later identified as Daniel Ryan Gore, was already known to the juvenile justice system. At the time of Milana's murder, he was on probation for previous offenses, including theft, arson, and other nonviolent crimes. This detail would later become a source of intense scrutiny and soul-searching within the community and the justice system. How does a 16-year-old with a history of criminal behavior escalate to murder? What warning signs were missed? What interventions might have prevented this tragedy? These are the questions that haunt everyone involved in juvenile justice. Questions that don't have easy answers, but demand to be asked nonetheless. As the investigation continued and more information became available, a picture began to emerge of Daniel Gore that was deeply disturbing. This was not a case of a good kid who made one terrible mistake. This was a pattern of escalating behavior that culminated in the most serious crime imaginable. Gore's history with the juvenile justice system included charges of theft and arson crimes that, while serious, are often viewed as nonviolent property offenses. But experts in criminal behavior know that there can be a progression in criminal activity, particularly when underlying issues go unaddressed. The willingness to set fires in particular is often seen as a warning sign of deeper psychological problems. What investigators discovered as they dug deeper into the case was that Gore had not simply encountered Milana by chance. The evidence suggested that he had specifically targeted her, that he had lured her away from safety with what prosecutors would later describe as the behavior of a wolf in sheep's clothing. This was predatory behavior, planned and deliberate. The details of how Gore gained Milana's trust and convinced her to come with him remain part of the court record, but they paint a picture of manipulation and deception that is particularly chilling when the victim is a 13-year-old girl. Children are naturally trusting, especially of teenagers who might seem mature and friendly. Gore exploited that trust in the most horrific way possible. Because Gore was 16 at the time of the crime, the case initially proceeded through the juvenile justice system. However, given the severity of the charges, murder, rape, and sexual abuse, prosecutors moved to have him tried as an adult. This decision reflects the recognition that some crimes are so serious, so beyond the scope of typical juvenile offenses, that they warrant adult consequences. The legal process in cases involving juveniles accused of serious crimes is complex and often lengthy. There are additional protections built into the system for young defendants, additional considerations about rehabilitation versus punishment, additional questions about brain development and criminal responsibility. All of these factors had to be weighed against the brutal reality of what had happened to Milana Lee. In July 2023, a judge ruled that Gore would indeed be tried as an adult. This decision meant that he would face adult penalties if convicted, including the possibility of life in prison. For Milana's family, this ruling represented a step toward justice, though no legal outcome could ever truly balance the scales of their loss. The trial of Daniel Gore began in November 2024. more than 2 years after Milana's murder. By this time, Gore was 18 years old, legally an adult, though he had been just 16 when he committed the crime that would define the rest of his life. Trials in murder cases are always difficult, but cases involving child victims carry an additional emotional weight that affects everyone in the courtroom. The jury had to hear evidence about what happened to Milana in her final moments, details that are necessary for justice but traumatic for everyone involved. The prosecution's case was built on forensic evidence that linked Gore to the crime. DNA evidence, physical evidence from the crime scene, and other forensic materials created a scientific framework that supported their narrative of what had happened. But beyond the technical evidence, prosecutors also had to tell the story of how a 16-year-old boy had deliberately targeted, assaulted, and murdered a 13-year-old girl. Senior Deputy District Attorney Sarah Pulver described Gore to the jury as a wolf in sheep's clothing, someone who had presented himself as harmless while harboring deadly intentions. This characterization captured something essential about the case: the way that predators often hide behind facades of normalcy, the way they exploit the trust and innocence of their victims. The defense faced an enormous challenge. The evidence against Gore was substantial, and the crime was so serious that any defense strategy would be an uphill battle. In cases like this, defense attorneys often focus on mitigating factors: the defendant's age, their background, mental health issues, or other circumstances that might explain, if not excuse, their behavior. On November 22, 2024, after deliberating for less than 90 minutes, the jury returned with their verdict. Daniel Gore was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree sexual abuse. The speed of the jury's deliberation suggested that they found the evidence overwhelming and the prosecution's case compelling. For Milana's family, the verdict represented a form of justice, though the kind that comes too late and costs too much. Their 13-year-old daughter, granddaughter, and sister was gone forever, and no jury verdict could bring her back. But the conviction meant that the person responsible for their unimaginable loss would be held accountable. The guilty verdict also provided some measure of closure for the community that had been shaken by Milana's murder. The knowledge that her killer had been identified, prosecuted, and convicted meant that this particular threat was no longer lurking in their neighborhoods, but it also raised ongoing questions about how such tragedies might be prevented in the future. In December 2024, Daniel Gore was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Milana Lee. However, because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, he will be eligible for parole after serving 15 years. This aspect of the sentence reflects the ongoing legal recognition that juvenile defendants, even those who commit the most serious crimes, are different from adult defendants in terms of their potential for rehabilitation. For Milana's family, the sentence represented both justice and frustration. Life in prison acknowledged the severity of the crime and ensured that Gore would spend decades behind bars. But the possibility of parole after 15 years meant that he might eventually be released while they continued to serve a life sentence of grief and loss. The sentencing also highlighted broader questions about juvenile justice and public safety. How do we balance the recognition that young people's brains are still developing with the need to protect society from those who commit violent crimes? How do we address the underlying factors that lead some teenagers to commit acts of unspeakable violence? These are questions that extend far beyond any individual case, but they are brought into sharp focus by tragedies like Milana's murder. More than 2 years after Milana Lee's murder, her family continues to grapple with a loss that has fundamentally changed their lives. Her grandmother's words about indescribable pain capture something universal about this kind of grief: the way it exceeds our capacity to understand or explain it, the way it becomes a permanent part of the landscape of a family's life. The community of Beaverton has also been changed by this tragedy. The sense of innocence and safety that once characterized the Murray Hill neighborhood has been replaced by a more vigilant awareness of the potential for violence. Parents make different choices about their children's freedom and independence. Neighbors pay closer attention to warning signs and concerning behavior. But there have also been positive changes that have emerged from this tragedy. Milana's classmates at Conestoga Middle School created homemade cards for her family, sharing condolences and memories that highlighted the impact she had on her peers. Despite her young age, the community came together during the search efforts and throughout the legal process, demonstrating the power of collective action in the face of tragedy. The murder of Milana Lee raises profound questions that extend far beyond the specifics of this case. How do we identify and intervene with young people who are on a path toward violence before they hurt someone? Daniel Gore's history of nonviolent crimes and his status on juvenile probation suggests that there were warning signs. But recognizing warning signs and acting effectively on them are two different things. The case also highlights the vulnerability of children in our communities, and the responsibility we all share for their protection. Milana was killed by someone who was himself still a teenager. Someone who should have been subject to the same protections and supervision that we extend to other young people. The failure to protect her represents not just an individual crime, but a systemic failure to address the root causes of youth violence. There are also broader questions about the juvenile justice system and its capacity to rehabilitate young offenders while protecting public safety. Gore was on probation at the time he committed murder, which raises questions about supervision, intervention, and the effectiveness of existing programs designed to redirect young people away from criminal behavior. In the end, though, this story is not primarily about criminal justice systems, or policy debates, or sociological analysis. It is about Milana Lee, a 13-year-old girl who deserved to grow up, to graduate from middle school and high school, to go to college or pursue her dreams, to fall in love and maybe have children of her own, to experience all the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that make up a human life. Her grandmother remembered her as someone who was always smiling, always agreeable, never angry. These memories paint a picture of a girl who approached the world with openness and trust, qualities that should have been protected but instead made her vulnerable to someone who exploited her innocence. The cards from her classmates suggest that despite her young age, Milana had already made an impact on the people around her. She was not just a victim of crime, she was a person with friends and family who loved her, with potential that will never be realized, with a future that was stolen from her and from everyone who cared about her. Cases like Milana's ripple outward in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Other parents hold their children a little tighter. Other communities examine their own safety measures and support systems. Other young people who might be struggling with violent impulses might get help before they hurt someone. The extensive media coverage of the case also serves an important function in holding our institutions accountable. The fact that Gore was on probation at the time of the murder has led to scrutiny of juvenile supervision programs. The fact that he was able to target and kill a 13-year-old girl has led to discussions about how we can better protect children from predators. But media coverage can also be a double-edged sword. While it serves important functions in terms of public awareness and accountability, it can also traumatize families who are already dealing with unimaginable loss. The Lee family has had to navigate their grief in the public eye, to see their daughter's story told and retold in ways that may not always capture who she really was. As of December 2024, Daniel Gore sits in an Oregon prison, beginning what will likely be a very long sentence. He will be eligible for parole in 2039 when he will be 33 years old. Whether he will actually be released at that time will depend on many factors, including his behavior in prison, his participation in rehabilitation programs, and the assessment of experts about whether he continues to pose a threat to public safety. Milana's family continues their life sentence of grief and loss. They will never have the opportunity to see her graduate, to walk her down the aisle at her wedding, to meet her children. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone that passes will be marked by her absence. The community of Beaverton continues to grapple with the lessons of this tragedy. Some changes are visible: increased security measures, more vigilant supervision of children, enhanced programs for at-risk youth. Other changes are less visible but equally important: the way neighbors look out for each other, the way parents talk to their children about safety, the way community members support families in crisis. True crime stories often focus on the perpetrators, their motivations, their methods, their psychology. But the most important person in this story is not Daniel Gore. It is Milana Lee, a 13-year-old girl whose life was cut short by an act of senseless violence. She was described by those who knew her as someone who was always smiling, always kind, never angry. In a world that often seems full of conflict and division, these qualities stand out as particularly precious. They remind us of what we lose when violence touches our communities, of what we must work to protect. The investigation into her murder was thorough and professional. The prosecution was competent and successful. The jury did their job conscientiously. The sentence was appropriate under the law. But none of these outcomes can restore what was taken from Milana's family and community. What we can do is remember her not just as a victim of crime, but as a person who mattered, who was loved, who had value that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. We can honor her memory by working to create communities where children are safer, where warning signs are recognized and acted upon, where tragedies like this are less likely to occur. We can also remember that behind every crime statistic, every news story, every court case, there are real people whose lives have been forever changed. Milana Lee was not just a headline or a case number. She was someone's daughter, someone's granddaughter, someone's classmate and friend. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. That every victim of violence is a whole person with their own story, their own dreams, their own irreplaceable place in the world. Milana Lee deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved to grow up, to live her life, to contribute to the world in whatever way she chose. That she was denied that opportunity is a tragedy that extends far beyond any individual case or legal outcome. It is a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities, and to work toward a world where stories like Milana's become increasingly rare. The case is closed. The perpetrator has been convicted and sentenced. But the work of preventing future tragedies, of protecting other children, of building safer and more caring communities, that work continues. It is work that we all share. Work that we owe to Milana Lee and to all the children who deserve to grow up safe and loved and free from violence. Her story ends here, but our responsibility to learn from it and to do better does not. In that ongoing commitment to protection and prevention, perhaps some meaning can be found in a tragedy that otherwise defies all understanding. Perhaps that is how we honor not just Milana's memory, but the memories of all the children whose stories ended too soon, whose potential was never realized, whose absence continues to echo in the lives of those who loved them. Now let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the small village of St. Johnsville, New York, nestled in the rolling hills of the Mohawk Valley, September nights carry the crisp promise of autumn. The air is cool and clean, filled with the scent of changing leaves and the quiet sounds of a rural community, settling into evening. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where night shifts at the local Stewart's convenience store are routine, safe, and unremarkable. On the night of September 25th, 2018, 21-year-old Michaela McVilla finished her shift at Stewart's Shops on West Main Street just after midnight. She locked up the store, gathered her things, and stepped out into the quiet darkness of a Tuesday night that had become Wednesday morning. It should have been the end of another ordinary workday, the beginning of a peaceful walk home through familiar streets. But Michaela McVilla never made it home that night. Her disappearance would shatter the calm of this small upstate New York community and lead to a complex investigation that would span weeks, involve cutting-edge forensic technology, and ultimately result in a murder trial that would captivate the region. This is the story of Michaela McVilla, a young woman whose life was taken too soon, and the investigation that sought to bring her killer to justice. Michaela McVilla was born in Missoula, Montana, but her family's journey had brought them across the country to the small village of St. Johnsville, New York. At 21, she was in that unique phase of life where the future feels both limitless and uncertain, where every day brings new possibilities and challenges. St. Johnsville is the kind of place that many people might pass through without noticing. A village of fewer than 2,000 residents tucked into the Mohawk Valley in Fulton County. But for those who call it home, it represents something valuable that's becoming increasingly rare in modern America. Community. Here people still wave to each other on the street, still know who belongs and who doesn't, still feel safe walking alone at night. The village sits along the historic route of the Erie Canal, and its streets tell the story of American expansion and industry. Main Street runs through the heart of the community, lined with the kinds of businesses that serve the practical needs of rural life. A hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and yes, a Stewart's Shops convenience store, where locals stop for coffee, gas, and the thousand small items that make daily life possible. Working at Stewart's was for Michaela more than just a job. In small communities like St. Johnsville, the people who work in local businesses become familiar faces, trusted members of the community fabric. The person who serves your morning coffee, who's there when you need milk at 10 o'clock at night, who knows your usual order without asking. These relationships matter in ways that might not be immediately obvious to outsiders. Michaela had been working the night shift, which in a place like St. Johnsville meant serving the occasional late-night customer, keeping the store clean and stocked, and providing a reassuring presence for anyone who might need something during the quiet hours between evening and dawn. Night shift work requires a particular kind of reliability and independence. You're often alone, responsible for the safety and security of the business, trusted to handle whatever situations might arise. The work suited Michaela's personality. Those who knew her described her as responsible and hardworking, someone who took her commitment seriously. At 21, she was building the kind of work ethic and reliability that would serve her well throughout her life. She was learning the skills that many young people develop during these formative years: how to manage responsibility, how to interact with the public, how to handle the small challenges that arise in any job. Her shift typically ended just after midnight, when the last customers had made their purchases. Then the store could be cleaned and prepared for the next day. The routine was familiar and comfortable. Count the register, clean the coffee machines, restock what needed restocking, lock up and head home through the quiet streets of a village that was largely asleep. In small towns, the late night hours have their own particular character. The streets are empty except for the occasional car of someone coming home from a late shift or an evening out. Porch lights create pools of warm light, and most windows are dark. There's a sense of peace and safety that comes from knowing your surroundings, from walking streets you've walked dozens of times before. For Michaela, the walk home from Stewart's was just another part of her routine, no different from any other night. She had no reason to expect that September 25th would be any different from the dozens of other nights she had closed the store and made her way home. The village felt safe. The night was calm, and she was simply a young woman finishing another day of work. But routine has a way of making us vulnerable. When we expect safety, we may not notice danger. When we trust in familiarity, we may not see the unusual. And sometimes the people we encounter in our daily lives, the faces that become familiar, may harbor intentions that we never suspect. Tuesday, September 25th, 2018, began like any other day for Michaela McVilla. The morning brought the typical sounds of St. Johnsville coming to life. School buses picking up children, adults heading to work. The gentle rhythm of a small community beginning another day. For Michaela, it meant preparing for another night shift at Stewart's, the routine that had become her normal pattern of work and rest. Working nights in a small town requires a different relationship with time and community. While most people are winding down their day, eating dinner with their families, settling in for evening television, night shift workers are just beginning their workday. There's something both isolating and peaceful about this schedule, a way of experiencing your community when it's quiet and still. The Stewart's on West Main Street sits at the heart of St. Johnsville's small commercial district. During the day, it serves as an informal community gathering place where locals stop for coffee and conversation, where people catch up on neighborhood news and gossip. But at night, especially after 10 or 11 o'clock, the customer traffic slows to a trickle. The store becomes a quiet outpost of light and warmth in a community that has largely gone to sleep. Michaela's shift that night was routine in every way. A few customers stopped in for late-night necessities. Someone picking up milk, another person buying cigarettes, perhaps a traveler passing through who needed gas and coffee. These interactions were brief and pleasant, the kind of routine customer service that makes up the bulk of convenience store work. As the hours passed, the store grew quieter. By 11 o'clock, customer traffic had slowed to almost nothing. This was the time of night when much of the work involved maintenance and preparation. Cleaning the coffee machines, restocking shelves, organizing displays, all the behind-the-scenes work that keeps a convenience store running smoothly. The quiet hours of a night shift can be meditative in their own way. There's something peaceful about working alone in a brightly lit store while the world outside grows dark and still. For someone like Michaela, who took pride in doing her job well, these hours provided an opportunity to take care of all the details that might be rushed during busier times. As midnight approached, Michaela began the familiar process of closing the store. This involved a series of routine tasks that she had performed dozens of times: counting the money in the register, cleaning and securing equipment, making sure everything was properly locked and alarmed. It was the kind of systematic routine that ensures nothing is forgotten, that the store would be ready for the next shift. The clock showed just after midnight when Michaela completed her closing procedures. September 25th had become September 26th, and her workday was officially over. She gathered her personal belongings, performed the final security check, and prepared to lock up the store and head home. Stepping outside into the cool September air, Michaela would have felt the satisfaction that comes from completing another night's work. The streets of St. Johnsville were quiet, lit by streetlights and the occasional porch light. It was the kind of peaceful scene that reinforces why people choose to live in small communities. The sense of safety, the feeling of belonging to something manageable and comprehensible. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation and legal proceedings. According to security footage and later court testimony, Michaela did not immediately head home as she normally would. Instead, she encountered someone she knew. Someone who was apparently familiar enough that she felt comfortable changing her usual routine. This encounter in the parking area outside Stewart's would prove to be the last time Michaela McVilla was seen alive by anyone other than her killer. The security cameras captured her walking away from the store, but they couldn't capture the conversation that led to that decision, the words that convinced her to go somewhere other than home. In small communities, trust comes naturally. When you know people, when you've seen them around town, when they're part of the familiar landscape of your daily life, it's easy to assume that they're safe, that their intentions are benign. This trust is one of the beautiful aspects of small-town life, but it can also be a vulnerability. As Michaela walked away from Stewart's that night, she was walking into a situation that would cost her life, but she had no way of knowing that. From her perspective, she was simply interacting with someone she recognized, someone who seemed familiar and unthreatening. The decision that would ultimately prove fatal probably seemed routine and harmless at the time. Wednesday, September 26, 2018, dawned clear and cool in St. Johnsville, with the kind of autumn weather that makes upstate New York particularly beautiful. The maple trees were beginning to show their fall colors, and there was that crisp energy in the air that comes with changing seasons. For most residents of the village, it was the start of another ordinary day. But for Michaela McVilla's family, Wednesday morning brought worry and confusion. Michaela had not come home from her shift at Stewart's, and this was completely unlike her. In families, especially close families, people develop routines and expectations. When someone who is reliable suddenly breaks their pattern without explanation, alarm bells begin to ring. Michaela's mother, Samantha Jump, later described the growing sense of dread that came with each hour that passed without word from her daughter. Michaela was responsible, the kind of person who called if she was going to be late, who stayed in touch with family members about her plans and whereabouts. Her absence was not just unusual, it was completely out of character. By Wednesday afternoon, the family's concern had escalated to the point where they contacted the New York State Police. Missing person reports in small communities are taken seriously, especially when they involve someone whose disappearance is so completely out of character. The state police began their investigation immediately, starting with the basic questions that form the foundation of any missing person case. The investigation began at Stewart's, where Michaela had last been seen. The store's security cameras provided crucial information about her final hours at work and the circumstances of her departure. The footage showed her completing her normal closing routine, but it also revealed something unexpected. She had not gone directly home as she usually did. The security cameras captured Michaela leaving the store area with someone else, someone who had apparently been waiting for her or had encountered her as she finished work. This was the first clue that her disappearance might not be a simple case of someone deciding to change their plans without telling family. Investigators began the process of interviewing people who knew Michaela, trying to understand her relationships, her recent activities, any problems or concerns she might have been facing. In small communities, this kind of investigation involves talking to people who often know each other, who can provide context about relationships and social dynamics that might not be immediately obvious to outsiders. The search for Michaela expanded beyond the immediate area around Stewart's. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in systematically searching the village and surrounding areas. In rural areas like the Mohawk Valley, searches can be challenging due to the terrain, thick woods, abandoned buildings, streams, and wetlands, all places where someone could be hiding or where evidence might be concealed. As Wednesday turned into Thursday and Thursday into Friday, the search intensified. The New York State Police brought in additional resources, including specialized search teams and investigators experienced in missing person cases. The community of St. Johnsville rallied around Michaela's family, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, and providing support to her worried relatives. The case began to attract media attention from regional news outlets. The story of a young woman disappearing after her night shift at a rural convenience store had elements that make for compelling news coverage. A sympathetic victim, a mysterious disappearance, and a community united in concern for one of their own. But for Michaela's family, the media attention was secondary to the desperate hope that she might still be found alive. Each day that passed without word made that hope more difficult to maintain. But families in these situations often cling to optimism, even when circumstances seem increasingly dire. The investigation continued around the clock, with detectives following up on every lead, every tip, every possible connection that might explain Michaela's disappearance. They analyzed her phone records, her social media activity, her financial transactions, looking for any clue that might indicate where she had gone or what had happened to her. As the search entered its second week, investigators were building a clearer picture of Michaela's final hours, but they still didn't know where she was or whether she was alive or dead. The security footage from Stewart's remained the most concrete evidence they had, but it raised as many questions as it answered. The break in the case came on October 2nd, 2018, exactly 1 week after Michaela's disappearance. A property owner in the nearby town of Oppenheim, about 20 miles from St. Johnsville, discovered something that would bring the search to a tragic conclusion. In a remote field, hidden in heavy brush and undergrowth, human remains were found. The location was isolated, the kind of place that might not be visited by anyone for months at a time. It was the kind of location that someone familiar with the area might choose if they wanted to conceal something permanently. The discovery of the remains brought an end to the hope that Michaela might still be alive, but it also provided investigators with crucial physical evidence that would eventually lead to an arrest and prosecution. The scene where her body was found would tell its own story about the final moments of her life and the actions of her killer. The discovery of human remains in the remote Oppenheim field on October 2nd, 2018, transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The New York State Police Major Crimes Unit took charge of the case, bringing specialized expertise in forensic investigation and criminal prosecution. The location where Michaela's body was found was significant in multiple ways. The field was isolated, accessible by dirt roads that most people wouldn't know about unless they were familiar with the area. It was the kind of place that suggested local knowledge, someone who understood the rural geography of Fulton County and knew where they might conceal evidence without it being quickly discovered. The condition of the remains provided investigators with crucial information about the manner of Michaela's death. The medical examiner determined that she had died from a gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range. The positioning of the body and the state of her clothing suggested that she had been dragged into the heavy brush where she was found, an attempt to hide her remains from casual discovery. Physical evidence recovered from the scene would prove crucial to the eventual prosecution of the case. DNA evidence, fiber evidence, and other forensic materials were carefully collected and sent to the state crime laboratory for analysis. Modern forensic science can extract an enormous amount of information from even small amounts of physical evidence, and investigators were hopeful that the crime scene would yield clues about the identity of Michaela's killer. The investigation now focused on understanding the timeline of events between Michaela's departure from Stewart's and the discovery of her body. The security footage showing her leaving with an unidentified person became even more significant, as investigators worked to identify who that person was and trace their movements during the relevant time period. Detectives began a systematic process of interviewing people who knew Michaela, looking for connections to the Oppenheim area where her body was found. The distance between Johnsville and Oppenheim suggested that her killer was someone with transportation and familiarity with both areas, someone who could move between them without attracting attention. As the forensic analysis progressed, investigators received information that would prove to be the breakthrough they needed. DNA evidence recovered from Michaela's body and clothing was processed through the state DNA database, and it yielded a match to someone who was already known to law enforcement. The match pointed to Daniel Nellis Sr., a 45-year-old man from Oppenheim. Nellis was not unknown to local law enforcement. He had previous contacts with police and a criminal record that included various minor offenses. More importantly, his residence in Oppenheim provided a connection to the area where Michaela's body had been found. The investigation into Nellis revealed additional information that strengthened the case against him. His property was located near the field where Michaela's remains were discovered, and he had access to vehicles that could have been used to transport her body to that location. Investigators also discovered that Nellis owned firearms, including weapons that could have been used in the shooting. As detectives dug deeper into Nellis's background and activities, they uncovered evidence that he had encountered Michaela on the night of her disappearance. This evidence came from multiple sources: witness statements, electronic evidence, and physical evidence that connected him to the crime. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source: Michaela's fitness tracker. The device, which she wore regularly to monitor her physical activity, had recorded crucial data about her final hours. The heart rate monitor showed a significant spike at approximately 12:24 a.m. on September 26th, followed by a rapid decline to zero. This electronic evidence provided investigators with a precise timeline for Michaela's death and corroborated other evidence they had gathered about the sequence of events. Modern technology, in the form of wearable devices that many people use for health and fitness monitoring, had become a silent witness to murder. The combination of DNA evidence, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and electronic data from Michaela's fitness tracker gave investigators a strong foundation for prosecution. But they also discovered additional evidence that would prove crucial in court: security camera footage from Nellis's own property. The cameras, installed for security purposes around Nellis's residence, had inadvertently recorded evidence of his involvement in Michaela's murder. The footage showed Michaela arriving at his property in the early morning hours of September 26, and it showed her leaving with Nellis several hours later. Crucially, the cameras showed Nellis returning alone. This visual evidence provided investigators with an almost complete picture of the events leading to Michaela's death. They could trace her movement from Stewart's to Nellis's property, document the time she spent there, and track the journey that ended with her body being dumped in the Oppenheim field. With DNA evidence, security camera footage, and forensic evidence from the crime scene, investigators had built a compelling case against Daniel Nellis. On November 15, 2018, nearly 2 months after Michaela McVilla's disappearance, Nellis was formally indicted by a Fulton County grand jury on charges of second-degree murder and multiple counts of criminal possession of a weapon. The indictment represented the culmination of weeks of intensive investigation by the New York State Police and other law enforcement agencies. The case had required coordination between multiple jurisdictions, sophisticated forensic analysis, and the careful assembly of evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. Second-degree murder in New York State is a Class AI felony, the most serious classification in the state's criminal code. It carries a potential sentence of 15 years to life in prison, reflecting the gravity of the crime and the impact on both the victim and the community. The additional weapons charges reflected the use of a firearm in the commission of the murder. Nellis was arrested at his Oppenheim residence without incident. The arrest brought a measure of relief to Michaela's family and to the St. Johnsville community, which had been dealing with the fear and uncertainty that comes with having an unsolved murder in their midst. For nearly 2 months, people had wondered whether the killer was still among them, whether they were safe in their own community. The arrest also marked the beginning of a new phase in the case, the legal proceedings that would determine whether Nellis would be held accountable for Michaela's death. Criminal trials and murder cases are complex affairs that can take months or even years to resolve, and they require prosecutors to present their evidence in a way that proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Fulton County District Attorney Louise Sierra announced that her office would prosecute the case vigorously, seeking justice for Michaela and her family. The prosecution team began the careful process of preparing for trial, organizing the evidence they had gathered, and building the narrative that would be presented to a jury. For Michaela's family, the arrest brought mixed emotions. Relief that someone had been charged with their daughter's murder was tempered by grief over her loss and anxiety about the legal process ahead. Criminal trials can be emotionally exhausting for victims' families, requiring them to relive the trauma of their loss while hoping for a just outcome. The community of St. Johnsville also grappled with complex emotions following the arrest. There was relief that the perpetrator had been caught, but also shock at learning the identity of the person charged with the crime. Nellis was not a complete stranger to the area. He lived in nearby Oppenheim and had connections to the broader community. The realization that someone local was capable of such violence was deeply unsettling. The case also raised questions about personal safety and trust in small communities. Michaela had apparently known Nellis well enough to go with him after her shift at Stewart's, suggesting a level of familiarity and trust that he had exploited. This betrayal of trust added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. Media coverage of the arrest was extensive, with regional news outlets covering both the charges against Nellis and the impact on the community. The case had captured public attention not just because of its tragic nature, but also because of the sophisticated investigative techniques that had been used to solve it. The electronic evidence from Michaela's fitness tracker, in particular, represented a relatively new development in criminal investigations. Wearable devices that monitor heart rate, activity levels, and location are becoming increasingly common, and law enforcement agencies are still learning how to use this type of data in criminal cases. The security camera footage from Nellis's own property also highlighted how ubiquitous surveillance technology has become in modern life. What Nellis may have installed for his own security became the very evidence that would be used to prosecute him for murder. As the case moved toward trial, both the prosecution and defense teams began their preparation. The prosecution had to organize a complex array of evidence and present it in a way that would convince a jury of Nellis's guilt. The defense faced the challenging task of countering DNA evidence, video evidence, and electronic data that all pointed to their client's involvement in the crime. The legal process would take many more months to unfold, but the arrest represented a crucial step toward justice for Michaela McVilla and her family. The murder trial of Daniel Nellis Sr. began on June 30, 2019, in Fulton County Court, presided over by Judge Herbert Shaw. Nearly 9 months had passed since Michaela McVilla's disappearance and death, and the community had been waiting anxiously for the legal process to provide answers and hopefully justice. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Louise Sierra and Assistant District Attorney Megan Brown, faced the task of presenting a complex case that relied heavily on forensic evidence, electronic data, and circumstantial evidence. While they had compelling evidence linking Nellis to the crime, they had to tell a coherent story that would convince a jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense team, representing Nellis, faced the challenging task of countering DNA evidence, security camera footage, and electronic data from Michaela's fitness tracker. Their strategy would focus on questioning the interpretation of the evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for the physical evidence that connected their client to the victim. The trial began with jury selection, a crucial process in any criminal case, but particularly important in a small community, where many potential jurors might have heard about the case or even known the victim or defendant personally. The judge and attorneys worked carefully to select jurors who could evaluate the evidence fairly despite the local notoriety of the case. In her opening statement, Prosecutor Megan Brown outlined the state's case against Nellis. She described how Michaela had encountered Nellis after her shift at Stewart's, how she had gone to his residence, and how she had been killed there before her body was transported to the remote field in Oppenheim where it was discovered. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the timeline they had constructed using various forms of electronic evidence. Security cameras showed Michaela arriving at Nellis's residence at 12:43 a.m. on September 26th, then leaving with him at 11:57 a.m. that same morning. Crucially, the cameras showed Nellis returning alone, suggesting that something had happened to Michaela during their time away from his property. The most dramatic evidence came from Michaela's fitness tracker, which had recorded her heart rate spiking at 12:24 a.m. and then dropping to zero. This electronic record provided what prosecutors argued was the exact moment of her death, creating a precise timeline that corroborated edit evidence in the case. DNA evidence was also central to the prosecution's case. Nellis's DNA had been found under Michaela's fingernails and on her clothing, suggesting a physical struggle between them. This forensic evidence provided a direct physical link between the defendant and the victim at the time of her death. The prosecution also presented evidence about the location where Michaela's body was found. The remote field was near Nellis's property, and investigators testified that it would have required local knowledge to know about the location and how to access it. The positioning of the body and the attempt to conceal it in heavy brush suggested that the killer was familiar with the area. The defense, led by Nellis's attorneys, faced the difficult task of explaining away the extensive physical and electronic evidence linking their client to the crime. Their strategy focused on suggesting that the relationship between Nellis and Michaela was consensual, and that her death might have occurred under different circumstances than those described by the prosecution. Nellis himself testified in his own defense, a risky decision that gave prosecutors the opportunity to cross-examine him about his actions and statements. In his testimony, he acknowledged that Michaela had been at his residence and that they had engaged in sexual activity, but he denied killing her. The defense argued that the physical evidence could be explained by consensual contact between Nellis and Michaela, and they questioned the prosecution's interpretation of the electronic evidence from her fitness tracker. They suggested that the heart rate spike could have been caused by something other than the attack that killed her. However, the defense faced significant challenges in explaining away the totality of the evidence. The security camera footage showed a clear timeline of events. The DNA evidence indicated a struggle, and the location where the body was found pointed to someone with knowledge of the local area. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the brutality of the crime and the evidence of Michaela's final moments. They argued that the physical evidence, electronic data, and circumstantial evidence all pointed to the same conclusion, that Nellis had killed Michaela and attempted to conceal his crime by dumping her body in a remote location. After several days of testimony and evidence presentation, the case went to the jury for deliberation. The 12 jurors had to weigh the extensive evidence presented by both sides and determine whether the prosecution had proven Nellis's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On June 25, 2019, after deliberating for approximately 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict in the murder trial of Daniel Nellis Sr. The courtroom was packed with Michaela McVill's family members, community supporters, media representatives, and others who had followed the case closely throughout the investigation and trial. When the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. For Michaela's family, this moment represented the culmination of nearly 10 months of grief, anxiety, and hope for justice. For the community of St. Johnsville, it offered the possibility of closure and answers about the tragedy that had shaken their small village. The jury found Daniel Nellis Sr. guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Michaela McVilla. They also found him guilty of criminal possession of a weapon in the first degree, reflecting their conclusion that he had used a firearm to commit the murder. The verdict represented a complete victory for the prosecution and validation of their theory of the case. As the verdict was read, visible emotion swept through the courtroom. Michaela's mother, Samantha Jump, later described feeling a mixture of relief and continued grief. The guilty verdict provided confirmation that justice had been served, but it could not bring back her daughter or undo the trauma that the family had endured. The conviction carried serious consequences for Nellis. Second-degree murder in New York State is punishable by a sentence of 15 years to life in prison, while the weapons charge carried additional potential penalties. The judge scheduled sentencing hearings, where both sides would have the opportunity to present arguments about the appropriate punishment. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued for a lengthy prison term that would reflect the severity of the crime and provide justice for Michaela and her family. They presented evidence about the impact of the murder on the victim's family and the broader community, emphasizing the need for a sentence that would acknowledge the gravity of taking a young woman's life. The defense argued for a more lenient sentence, presenting mitigation evidence about Nellis's background and circumstances. In capital cases, defense attorneys often focus on humanizing their clients and presenting factors that might justify a less severe punishment, even after a conviction. Michaela's family members were given the opportunity to present victim impact statements, describing how her death had affected their lives and expressing their views about appropriate punishment for her killer. These statements provide courts with crucial information about the human cost of violent crime and help judges understand the full impact of the defendant's actions. In August 2019, Judge Shaw sentenced Daniel Nellis Sr. to 25 years to life in prison for the murder conviction, along with an additional 15 years for the weapons charge. The total sentence of 40 years to life ensured that Nellis would spend the majority, if not all, of his remaining life in prison. The sentence reflected the serious nature of the crime and the judge's assessment of the evidence presented during the trial, with the possibility of parole only after serving 25 years on the murder charge, plus the additional weapons sentence. Nellis would be in his 70s before he could even be considered for release. For Michaela's family, the sentence provided some sense of closure and justice. While no punishment could truly compensate for their loss, the lengthy prison term ensured that Nellis would be held accountable for his actions and prevented from harming others. The St. Johnsville community also found some measure of peace in the resolution of the case. The conviction and sentence confirmed that their justice system had worked, that the person responsible for Michaela's death had been identified, prosecuted, and punished. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped the community following her disappearance could finally begin to subside. The case also demonstrated the power of modern forensic science and investigative techniques. The combination of DNA evidence, electronic data from wearable devices, and security camera footage had provided investigators with the tools they needed to solve the case and secure a conviction. However, the legal story of the Michaela murder case would not end with Nellis's conviction and sentencing. The case would take an unexpected turn that would demonstrate the complexity of the American legal system and the ongoing challenges of achieving final justice in criminal cases. The conviction and sentencing of Daniel Nellis Sr. appeared to bring the Michaela murder case to a definitive close. For nearly 4 years following his conviction in 2019, Nellis served his sentence in a New York State correctional facility, and Michaela's family began the long process of rebuilding their lives around the reality of their loss. But in June 2023, nearly 5 years after Michaela's murder, the case took a dramatic and unexpected turn that would reopen old wounds and raise new questions about justice and legal procedure. The New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division 3rd Judicial Department unanimously overturned Nellis's murder conviction. The appellate court ruled that the trial judge had committed reversible error by allowing the prosecution to present certain evidence that should have been excluded from the trial. The appellate court's decision focused on what they determined was prosecutorial misconduct during the original trial. According to the court's ruling, prosecutors had repeatedly presented inadmissible evidence to the jury, despite objections from the defense. The court found that this misconduct had created prejudice that cannot be overstated, and had denied Nellis his right to a fair trial. The specific nature of the prosecutorial misconduct involved the repeated presentation of evidence that the trial judge had ruled inadmissible. When prosecutors continue to present evidence that has been excluded by the court, it can create unfair prejudice against the defendant and undermine the integrity of the trial process. The appellate court's decision was particularly significant because it was unanimous, meaning that all the judges on the panel agreed that the errors were serious enough to warrant overturning the conviction. In criminal appeals, unanimous decisions carry particular weight and suggest that the legal errors were clear and substantial. The overturned conviction meant that Nellis's murder conviction was vacated, and he could no longer be held in prison on that charge. The case would need to be retried if prosecutors chose to pursue a retrial, bringing the case back to where it had begun nearly 5 years earlier. The appellate court's decision sent shockwaves through the St. Johnsville community and devastated Michaela's family, who had believed that justice had finally been served. The prejudice that resulted from prosecutorial misconduct and the trial judge's failure to intervene cannot be overstated. The judges ruled in reversing the murder conviction of Daniel Nellis for the death of Michaela McVilla. The ruling highlighted serious problems with how the original trial had been conducted. According to findings from the appeals court, there were several errors during the trial, and before the trial, the prosecution requested to introduce certain evidence, but when the trial judge ruled against allowing this evidence, prosecutors continued to reference it anyway, creating what the appellate court determined was irreversible prejudice against the defendant. For Michaela's mother, Samantha Jump, and the rest of her family, the overturned conviction represented a devastating setback. They had endured the trauma of the trial, found some measure of peace in the guilty verdict, and had been attempting to rebuild their lives around the reality of Nellis's imprisonment. Now they faced the possibility of having to relive the entire ordeal through a new trial. It will be sent back to Fulton County for a possible retrial. The decision of whether to retry the case would fall to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, which would have to weigh the strength of their evidence against the challenges of presenting it properly in a new trial. The overturned conviction also meant that Nellis was released from prison, where he had been serving his 40-year-to-life sentence. For the St. Johnsville community, this created a renewed sense of fear and uncertainty. The man who had been convicted of murdering one of their own was now free, pending the decision about whether to retry the case. The case raised important questions about the balance between ensuring fair trials for defendants and protecting the rights of victims and their families. Prosecutorial misconduct, while relatively rare, can have devastating consequences for the administration of justice. When prosecutors fail to follow proper procedures, it can result in guilty verdicts being overturned, forcing families to endure additional trauma and potentially allowing dangerous individuals to go free. In the months following the appellate court's decision, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office faced a difficult choice. They could proceed with a retrial, armed with the same physical evidence that had originally convinced a jury of Nellis's guilt, but they would have to present it without the procedural errors that had led to the conviction being overturned. The evidence in the case remained compelling. DNA evidence linking Nellis to Michaela, security camera footage showing her at his residence, and the electronic data from her fitness tracker that provided a timeline of her final moments. However, the prosecution would have to be extremely careful to follow proper legal procedures and avoid the mistakes that had led to the conviction being overturned. For the defense, the overturned conviction provided an opportunity to present their case more effectively. They would have the benefit of knowing exactly what evidence the prosecution planned to present and could prepare more thoroughly to counter it. The appellate court's ruling had also highlighted weaknesses in the prosecution's case that could be exploited in a new trial. The decision about whether to retry the case would involve multiple considerations. The district attorney's office would have to assess the likelihood of obtaining another conviction while following proper legal procedures. They would also have to consider the impact on Michaela's family, who had already endured one trial and would face the emotional trauma of going through the process again. The passage of time also created additional challenges for a potential retrial. Witnesses' memories fade, physical evidence can deteriorate, and the community's attention moves on to other matters. While the most crucial evidence in the case, the DNA, security footage, and fitness tracker data, would remain as compelling as ever, other aspects of the case might be more difficult to present effectively years after the original trial. For Michaela's family, the uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the situation. They had experienced the relief of seeing their daughter's killer convicted and sentenced, only to have that conviction overturned on technical grounds. Now they faced the possibility of having to relive the entire ordeal through a new trial, with no guarantee of the same outcome. The legal system's focus on procedural fairness, while essential to protecting the rights of all defendants, can sometimes feel like a betrayal to victims' families who believe that justice has already been served. The overturned conviction in Michaela's case highlighted the tension between ensuring fair trials and providing closure for those who have lost loved ones to violence. As the case entered this new phase, it served as a reminder of the complexity of the American criminal justice system. Even when evidence appears overwhelming, even when a jury has spoken definitively, the legal process includes multiple layers of review designed to ensure that convictions are obtained fairly and legally. The story of Michaela McVilla's murder had become more than just a tale of a young woman's tragic death and the investigation that followed. It had become a case study in the challenges of prosecuting serious crimes, the importance of following proper legal procedures, and the ongoing struggle to balance the rights of defendants with the needy justice for victims. Whether the case would ultimately result in a new trial, a plea agreement, or some other resolution remained to be seen. But for the small community of Johnsville, for Michaela's family, and for all those who had followed the case, the overturned conviction served as a sobering reminder that the path to justice is often longer and more complex than it initially appears. The case continues to serve as a testament to Michaela's memory and a reminder of the preciousness of life. Whether through a new trial or other legal proceedings, the search for final justice in her case continues, guided by the hope that truth will ultimately prevail and that those responsible for taking her life will be held accountable. As we reach the end of our time together, the story of Michaela McVilla remains, in many ways, unfinished. What began as the tale of a young woman's tragic death and the investigation that led to her killer's conviction has evolved into something more complex, a story about the intricate workings of the justice system and the ongoing quest for truth and accountability. Michaela's life, though cut tragically short, touched many people in her small community of St. Johnsville. She was a daughter, a friend, a reliable coworker who took pride in her work and her responsibilities. Her death sent shockwaves through a community that had always felt safe, reminding everyone that tragedy can strike anywhere, anytime. The investigation that followed her disappearance showcased the power of modern forensic science, from DNA analysis to electronic evidence from wearable devices. It demonstrated how dedicated law enforcement professionals can piece together complex puzzles and follow evidence to its logical conclusion. The initial conviction seemed to provide the closure that Michaela's family and community desperately needed. But the overturned conviction reminds us that the pursuit of justice is not always a straight line. The legal system includes multiple safeguards designed to ensure fairness, and sometimes these safeguards require that even seemingly certain outcomes be reconsidered. The appellate court's decision, while devastating for Michaela's family, reflects the system's commitment to ensuring that all defendants receive fair trials. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember Michaela McVilla, not just as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who lived her life with purpose and responsibility. Remember the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve her case, the family members who never gave up hope for justice, and the community that rallied around them in their time of need. The story continues, and someday perhaps it will reach a final conclusion that brings peace to all those who loved Michaela. Until then, her memory serves as a reminder to cherish each day, to value the people in our lives, and to never take for granted the simple blessing of safety and security. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.